I'm so pleased with myself just putting a
So we're now live. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to our virtual World Whisky tasting. We've got lovely Stef joining us this evening to take us through the range that we've got. We've got some really fantastic whiskies. Stef is great as well, really knowledgeable. And yeah, we're looking forward to this one. It's been a popular one, this one. We've had a lot of interest in it. So good to see that people are looking forward and looking at whiskies of the world and not kind of sticking just to what we know. So yeah, it'll be a nice little exploration of the world, and hopefully we're traveling out from where we are at the moment.
That's what I was about to say. Like, we were just talking about it, like, live vicariously through whiskey.
Yeah. Pretend we're elsewhere. So yeah, we usually like to give people a couple of minutes to get everyone settled in, but yeah, and to those people not watching it now or who are watching it at a later date as well, welcome. And I hope everyone I hope everyone's going to enjoy it. If you do have any questions or anything, do let us know. So we've got the comments section on here. You can pop questions in. We'll see all them. I've got the emails and stuff if you prefer not to do that, or Facebook. So yeah, do let us know for any questions or comments, and we could answer them. So yeah. And I'll let Stef do a little introduction to herself. I know some of you will be familiar with Stef. She hosted the Japanese whiskey tasting we did last year. When did we do it now? Was it November? October,
I think. Yeah, I think I was here. It was my first time using this platform, whereas now I know it.
So yeah, we did the Japanese whiskey one last year, which again was quite popular. But yeah, we've got some new faces on this one as well. So
yeah. brand new distillery as well, which I'm super excited about showing everyone. So yes, I'm Stef, everyone. Hello. I work for a company called Speciality Brands, and we import and distribute all the whiskies that you're going to taste tonight. We also have an amazing selection of other tasty things, which Starmore Boss know and love. So if any of you have tried any Diplomatico or Cocky or Tapatio, or God, I can't remember what else. We have millions of things. Then thank you. That's one of ours. So we import sort of really top quality things that you make in really tiny batches using historical traditional methods. So kind of our company idea basically. And yes, we are going to travel around the world tonight. Hopefully everyone's got their fake passports ready. There'll be a lot of very inefficient traveling around the world, to be honest. We're going to do going to go round and back again, and then round again, and then the other way. But yeah, lots and lots of flavors tonight. So hopefully if you know your whiskey, there'll be some stuff that you haven't tried before, maybe some things that you didn't realize before. And if you are new to whiskey, this is a great overview of lots of different producing countries. So yeah, it'd be nice.
Yeah, we've got some good stuff lined up as well, and some stuff that you wouldn't, I suppose, expect. Like we have, I'm sure everyone's noticed, we have the Amrit on there, which is an Indian whiskey, and not something that you would necessarily immediately associate with that. But yeah, some really, really nice stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Japanese is the one that's been, going bigger. People are looking outside I'm going to call the traditional whiskey making countries in the last few years. So Japanese is kind of the big one, but we have, two other countries in Asia tonight. So we've got India and Taiwan, who are making absolutely delicious stuff as well. And I think, it's as Japanese stuff gets harder and harder to get a hold of. Trying these other styles is a great way to get different flavors. So, yeah.
So, should we crack on then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my spinning world. I'm just so pleased about getting a moving picture in a presentation. So sorry for anyone who's met me before knows I love a map, and particularly when we do this this tasting, I think the climate of a country, the landscape of a country, people, the palate does have such a huge impact on the flavor that you get. So and for me, working out where something is, if people say, when I first heard about our Taiwanese whiskey, I couldn't help but being a bit distracted with, I went to Thailand when I was a teenager. And so, I was like, well, hold on, which country is this where? So just to make sure everyone's aware of where everything is, got a little cheeky shout out to Nick Cotton, Anna. Happy birthday. I know I'm so excited.
Before we start properly as well, I do want to apologise. Those that have done the tastings before will have known we usually send the link out a little bit sooner. I only sent the link out this morning because I was off at the beginning of the week. So it was my birthday. And then I've been like a day behind. So yesterday I was like, oh, it's Tuesday. Today is like, it's Wednesday. I've got some time. And then I realised this morning, I was like, oh, I need to get it out. But yeah, hopefully everyone's
Happy birthday for earlier in the week.
Thank you. So, yeah, there's quite a few birthdays at the moment as well. So happy birthday to anyone celebrating. Yeah. I do apologise for the late link on that one.
Hopefully they've all made it.
This morning I was like, oh no, I need to get it sorted. Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is introduce you, and I do each country, is introduce you to each country with the map, and show you, talk a little bit about the climate, talk a little bit, obviously, about the whiskey styles from that country, and then we'll talk about the specific thing that we're tasting. So without further ado, let's get into whiskey number one. Now, I'm not sure if you've got numbers on them or if you've told people what order, but whiskey number one is called Drumshambo.
This guy.
And actually, I must show people the box because this is, and usually I don't care about packaging. For me, it's all about the liquid, how they've made it, how the flavors got there. And I'm like, so long as it doesn't look offensive, I am fine. But I absolutely love this box. So this is the Drumshambo box. And when I first got this, I was digging into it with my nails around the corners, around the sides. I could not work out how to open it. And I was
the same. We were like trying to get it because the way it's kind of done, like the flaps kind of go over the top of it. I'm trying to get underneath, and I was like,
and it looks sealed, and there's a tiny wee, what looks like a finger hole here, but you can't really get your finger in it. And I was like, oh my god, this is annoying. And I deal with a lot of whiskey box a lot of the time, so I was like, I should really know how to do this. I was looking at the bottom and just not sure what I was up to. And then I just got a bit bored and just pulled the bottle in the top, and it opened up like a trapdoor. And it is I love this whiskey. It's absolutely delicious, but it's amazing. The mechanism, like the smoothness of it. And whatever they've made it of, to make it just be perfect every time really pleases me. So whenever I start talking about this one, that's the first thing I need to mention. So I'm
going to keep that in mind because like both me and my colleague Sarah were there trying to like get in, but like, what is going on with this box? It was actually a really simple way. You just pull it out.
Yeah, and sometimes you're like, okay, packaging is avoiding drunk people being able to open it. That is fine, I agree. But like, I am sober. This is 10 o'clock in the morning. Why is it not? So yeah, just hold onto it and pull, and everything opens up like a really nice trapdoor. So just little things excite us nowadays. So we are going to Ireland. Those of you who have seen the map and have recognised the shape of that, hopefully, and the cities on it. And this is Drumshambo. So it's just in the Republic of Ireland, but quite near the top, quite near the border with Northern Ireland. And it's kind of super countryside, really hilly, not an area that's been making whiskey for at least 100 years. Actually, it's 106 years since these guys have had a whiskey in that area. So it's called Drumshambo, named after the wee town, between town and village, let's say, where it's made. And they actually opened this distillery in 2014. So this is our new one of the evening. So they've only been making whiskey for a wee while. The guy who set it up actually has history of making lots of other types of booze in Ireland. He's one of the guys responsible for Bailey's. He made Sheridan's liqueur and another whiskey which I've forgotten the name of. So he's done quite a few things, but that was all working for other companies. This is his own distillery and his own project. So it's a distillery called the Shed Distillery, and they make a gin as well called Drumshambo also. But obviously the whole time they've been making the gin and selling the gin, they've been waiting for the whiskey to age and be released, and they released it last year. So it's super exciting and new, and hopefully many of you won't have tasted this before at all.
It's got a lovely nose.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what everyone's smelling so far. I have a few smells, I have a couple of little sips if you are ready. It's 43%, so a nice, easy, sort of gentle start. I don't know, like going up and down this evening. But a nice, easy, gentle start. Now, it's actually called an Irish pot still, a single pot still. So single in Ireland means the same as it does in Scotland. We're talking about single malts. So it means made at one distillery. but this pot still thing. So it's not a single malt. And this is actually an amazing piece of history and my favorite bits about Irish whiskey. This is a category that only really Ireland does. And it actually comes from taxation. And when the English were getting a bit concerned about the amount of whiskey that both Scotland and Ireland were making, they started taxing malted barley because that's what they were making all the whiskies from. Now, the Scottish guys just kind of went into hiding. They went up into the hills. There's tons of land around there, and went off and hid and made it in secret and made it illegally. And that's kind of generally what they did. And the Irish went a different route, and it's super clever, and I love it. It's because quite a lot of the main centres of whiskey production in Ireland were the cities, so it was a bit difficult to sort of hide what you were doing. But what they did was that rather than using 100% malted barley for making the whiskey, they used a wee bit of malted barley and then mixed that with unmalted barley. So you're saving a bit of money because it's cheaper anyway, and you're not paying tax on the unmalted barley. So I love a tax avoidance scheme, particularly when it results in a new type of booze. So I'm sure everyone is aware if you drink single malts normally, but single malts usually give you a flavour like malted Maltesers, malted milk, mocha, all those kind of flavours. Quite savoury. Unmalted barley is much more herbaceous, much more green, got a wee bit more spice and tingle to it. So look out for that flavour here. Now, the other rule that's also traditional in Irish pot still is you're allowed up to 5% of other grains. So it has to be at least 30% of unmalted and malted barley, so 30% of each. And then obviously, you're allowed 5% of other grains too. And so these guys actually also use some oats from the Barrow region, south of Ireland. So really creamy oats. And I'm not sure if anyone's getting the nose on the taste. Oats give you such a really unusual texture. And if anyone's getting kind of banana porridge kind of action, then I would say
it's got like that kind of, like, it smells really tropical. This is going to sound really odd, but it actually reminds me almost of a Jamaican rum. It's got that character where it's like quite tropical, but then like also quite fresh and green, and like creamy as well.
Absolutely. And obviously, the Jamaican guys, when they were learning how to make rum, or starting to make rum, it was the people coming from Britain, the colonists essentially, who started making rum using the same methods they were making back home, making whiskey. So everything else about the production is really similar to Scottish single malts. The main other thing is it's triple distilled, and most Irish whiskies, not all, are triple distilled. So obviously in Scotland, the standard is 2 times, but again, some distilleries in Scotland will do 3, and these guys do triples. So, but apart from that, really, really kind of what you'd expect from whiskey production. But like I say, just we've got this unmalted barley and these oats in here. So hopefully everyone's getting the creaminess, the deliciousness. Now, I'm not sure, again, how much everyone follows Irish whiskey, but there has been sort of a big, not a shortage, but she used to be super popular. And then after, Prohibition in America, the wars, all kinds of stuff happened that made most of the Irish whiskey distilleries close down. And there's only been a few for the last kind of 50 odd years. And even if there's lots of brands coming out, actually all of those are just getting liquid from these same couple of distilleries. So the exciting thing about Drumshanbo is they've distilled and made everything themselves, but they have been going only since 2014. So this is, around a 5-year-old whiskey, a little bit 4.5, maybe some 5.5-year-old in here as well. And this is their only product so far. So apart from the gin, and they also make vodka. So just really, really interesting.
I really like
the thing on this, I'm absolutely loving drinking it. It's super interesting. Like I say, those flavors of the unmalted barley and the oats, just so unusual.
It's so nice on its own, but I can imagine it really nice, like going really well in like a highball or something as well, and just being super refreshing and very. It's a very easy drinking whiskey, like.
Exactly, and that's part of the thing that the triple distillation is for. Okay, and I think if I do this, sometimes I do this oil tasting and not tell you where things came from as we tasted them. Maybe do that next time. I sort of ask people the difference between Irish whiskey and Scottish whiskey, and a lot of people say Scottish whiskey is peated, which isn't always the case, and there are some Irish that are peated, but sure, in a general rule, you could go there. But the sort of more correct answer is that Irish whiskey is usually lighter. Okay, and that's because of the triple distillation. So it will strip away more flavour and give you a bit more of a purer kind of flavour as well. So so that's kind of the difference here. So this is a great one to start off with because it's light, it's easy, it's super smooth. It's like I say, around the 5-year-old mark. It's aged in a combination of ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. So if anyone's getting any kind of raisiny notes on the nose, honey notes on the nose, banana and honey porridge for me. That's my tasting note. That's coming from the sherry, and obviously the Kentucky bourbon's going to be giving you some vanilla and some spice as well. So, but just a lovely whiskey. So yeah, new, and I'm excited about these guys. I think they are obviously they're doing tiny little batches, like selling about a barrel a day. So not very much, but they are keeping some aside. They're going to start doing some cask finishes and create a little range in the future. But this is their first one. Well, they did an inaugural release, which was basically this one, but in a slightly different bottle, which was limited, and we never got any. But this is their only release at the moment.
We've had a few inaugural first releases.
Yeah, exactly.
Recently, from a few different distilleries, and they're great, but at the same time, it's like they come in and go out like that. They're just gone. So
yeah.
I can imagine when they've done a few, like when they first started and done it, it's just been snapped up straight away. So, but anyway,
exactly.
Yeah, I really like this. It's quite a lengthy whiskey though, considering it's still quite light. There's a good length on it, and good finish as well.
I think the oats are really holding the flavour for like a nice long time. So I think we'll see this later in another whiskey that we try. It's using a combination of grains, but it's balancing out the different flavors that grains bring is really interesting. Obviously, you don't get that with single malt because it has to be 100% malted barley, and that's perfectly delicious. But then sort of seeing how other people combine different grains together to get different flavors is pretty cool. Do
you think there's been a bit more of a kind of people are kind of starting to realize as well? Obviously, just for quite some time, it seems that people kind of look at blended whiskey as a sort of as the product that's not as good as a single malt. People are like, oh, I want a single malt Scotch, but we've started to see, obviously, with Japanese, and we'll touch on that later, and with the Irish as well, and a couple of other countries that they're pushing the boundaries more with blending and actually kind of making people realize that the kind of art of blending. Do you think that's going to start changing more in terms of the Scottish market as well? Do you think we might see that grow a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's weird people don't realize, but booze kind of has fashions the same as fashion does. It's not quite as quick. There's not like many seasons in a year. But things will slowly change. Like I sort of say at the moment, I know you guys did a cognac tasting last month.
Yeah.
But cognac's kind of uncool. There's only a few people that drink cognac. It's not talked about loads. There's not much knowledge about it in the UK. These sales have just been kind of decreasing for years and years and years. And it's getting so uncool that it's now becoming cool again. And that's kind of how booze goes. And so blended whiskey's got that same thing. When I was growing up, it was what my granny drank. And single malt was what the people who really knew what they were doing drank. But some single malts, you'd never dream of drinking them kind of, with your lunch, mid-afternoon, before dinner, in a highball, whereas a blend, that's exactly what that's for. So I think a lot of people are starting to realise, and, liking more elegant, balanced things. So, I mean, it all comes around in cycles.
There's definitely an art in blending, and I think it's really nice to see it kind of come out as well, and see how blending does create different kind of flavor profiles. And just touching on things that were uncool and becoming cool again, I feel like that's quite a good analogy of things like sherry as well. Like sherry seems to be having a little bit of a kind of reboot, and people are realizing, sherry's not just the cream sherry that you grand and used to drink, or that sort of, you get such lovely kind of.
I've been working on that one personally for the last 9 years. Sherry. I don't get paid for it, but I've been to her loads of times. I convert all my family, all my friends. Everyone must drink sherry.
I'm still working on the Chardonnay. I'm still convinced. I've got a lot of friends that won't touch it. Like, oh, we don't like Chardonnay, and I know there's a lot of people that don't, but I personally love it, and I'm a believer that there is a Chardonnay out there for everybody.
I am with you. I got my mum back into it recently. I was like, no, mum, just go, because she's a Sauvy B, a New Zealand Sauvy B has to be. But I'm like, no, I know Chardonnay, mum, you're going to love it. Come on, it's
this is what I'm trying to push my friends to. I'm like, come on, guys.
So there are fashions, and things need to become unfashionable to become fashionable again. Tequila's been coming in for years, as is mezcal. Rum has been grown for ages. Gin has gone big peak, but then is it sort of decreasing again?
Gone down, definitely.
Yeah, so and every different thing will have a different speed of doing it. Like rum's been growing for way longer than gin has, but it's doing it in a much slower fashion.
Yeah.
And it's still growing, whereas gin's already sort of done it now.
Yeah, it's yeah, definitely. It's interesting to see how that's gone, but
yeah. So Irish whiskey is basically having a bit of a comeback. Not just people drinking it, but also the distilleries that are opening. There's loads of new distilleries opening. Quite a lot of them don't have product ready for sale yet. But do watch the space in the next few years. I think if anyone's looking for a new region to get a bit geeky about, to really explore in Irish whiskey, then Irish whiskey is a great one. Sorry. So and you know, got a few different categories in it, like Scotch. So you've got single malt like Scottish, you've got blends like Scottish, like Jameson's. But then you have this extra category. So single pot still is an extra one as well. So yeah, really worth looking into. So everyone okay with whiskey number one? I feel like everyone's being very, very polite so far.
Yeah, nice. Right. If anyone has any thoughts on them, do let us know, because we do like it when people put them in. It makes it good. So
yeah. So that's a nice picture of a still at this lovely new distillery. I'm not sure if anyone's been to many Scotch distilleries, but quite often the stills don't look quite as clean as that, and that's because
I was going to say they're very shiny.
They're shiny as stills. So yeah, absolutely beautiful. And then some lovely barrels. So, you know, just making sure I talk about everything. And there are some key facts, but I think I went through all of those, apart from it's non-chill filtered. So yeah, I love the drum shambo. So, oh yes, and there's some tasting notes too, but I think we covered off most of those. Let's see, can we get coconut? We did mention coconut. Almond. Yeah, I think we got most of those. So yeah, the head distiller there is called Brian Taft. He's American, actually. He worked in quite a lot of different, not just distilleries, but also wineries and breweries in America before moving over to Ireland. So yeah, he's great. I've not met him yet because obviously everything's been over video call since we took on this brand. So it's quite exciting. It's one of the ones I've not been to, but at least it's not far. So hopefully when we do get to travel.
That's true. Yeah, it's not like you're trying to go to Japan. But
no, exactly. So hopefully that'll open up nice and quickly, and we'll be able to get to visits. But I think if anyone is in Ireland, I don't know where people are watching from, or it gets over to Ireland soon, you know, the Shed Distillery in Drumshambo has got a lovely visitor centre, and you can go and taste the gin and stuff as well. So definitely worth doing. Right, now we're going to get on a plane, and we're going to go quite far away. And we're going to go to Taiwan. So this is Kavalan whiskey from Taiwan. Thank you. Lovely. I need to... So this is what I was saying about geography. Just to make sure everyone knows where Taiwan is, there, put that nice big arrow pointing at it. So it's an island off the coast of China. And I'm sure people maybe noticed in the news the last few years, it's kind of counted as part of China by some countries and kind of counted as potentially independent or separate by other countries. Now, the interesting thing about Taiwan is this whiskey, this Kavalan Distillery, is their first ever single malt distillery. So again, another kind of new guys drinking, new guys making whiskey in a place that's not made it ever before or for quite a while. And the interesting thing is because of Taiwan sort of being within that kind of group of China, it had a monopoly on booze production up until 2002. And in 2002, it joined the World Trade Organization. And as part of that, they had to relax the rules on the monopoly. So suddenly independent companies are allowed to make alcohol. And these guys immediately are like, we are going to research and build a single malt distillery. Now, that kind of seems to me like a decision out of nowhere. And I'm not sure if anyone's ever thought about it, but building a whiskey distillery, quite expensive. You've got to buy a lot of expensive equipment, and it's not great for your profit for the first few years because you've got to age the bloody stuff for ages, all right, until you can sell it. So you spend tons of money and then you're just making nothing back for ages. So it's a big risk, and particularly doing it in a country with a climate that you've not tried before. I'm not sure if anyone can see on that map, but Taiwan is basically on the line of the Tropic of Cancer. So this is tropical in the south and subtropical in the north. So it is roasting pretty much all year round, really, really humid. And got some lovely big sort of rain showers and typhoon action happening as well if you want some excitement. So again, not what we call traditional whiskey making climate. So quite risky to sort of decide to build a distillery here. But luckily, the guys who did do it, they own one of Taiwan's biggest food and drink producing companies. So they've got plenty of money. They're not stressed about making some profit back very quickly. And so they built this distillery, and they built it in 2005. And actually, it only took them 9 months to build, which is absolutely amazing.
That's really quick.
They started it in March and then finished it in December. So yeah.
I'm sure sometimes, like, I know a lot of the stills are built in, depending on obviously where you get them from, but a lot of them are built in places like Germany and things like that, and they can take about 6 months for them to build the still and then get it over to you in the first place. So
yeah,
to get the whole distillery up and running in 9 months is that's remarkable.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually kind of joke, I'm not sure anyone thinks of Taiwan. And like I say, when I thought of Taiwan before I started doing this job, I was a bit like, Taiwan, Thailand? Oh my God, I'm not sure. Are they different? Didn't do geography at school. But, for key points, when you do think of Taiwan, I was a child of the 80s. So for me, Taiwan was the bottom of every single plastic toy made in Taiwan. Or pictures like this. So huge, amazing sort of skyscrapers, massive cities. It was the world's tallest building at one point. It's now, I'm going to say, the 8th tallest building in the world. So, building big things. So kind of that makes sense, right? They build the distillery super fast because they're really good at making stuff. Okay, that's what they excel at. Yeah, super efficient. Okay, and it's a third the size of Scotland with 4 times the population. So hence the massive cities and the huge skyscrapers and stuff. Just to give you a bit of a comparison. Absolutely stunning country. Again, sorry, I'm going to make everyone to have a lot of whiskey-related holidays by the end of this. But absolutely glorious. Okay, so great food scene as well. If you love dumplings, which I do, then it's a great place to go. So these guys, like I say, built this distillery in 2005. They chose an area up in the northeast of Taiwan. I've got the temperatures up there on the slide. So, 14 degrees in the coldest night of winter. That is a Scottish summer. So, completely different.
It's been like about 10, 11 degrees in Sheffield today, but it's been really sunny and it's been glorious. Everyone's like, I put this jumper on today and I was like, oh, it's too warm for the jumper when I got into it. It's only 11 degrees. So, yeah, to have 14 degrees in winter is...
Yeah, exactly. So again, like the riskiness of building this distillery and thinking you're going to be able to age whiskey here is a big deal. 80% humidity, nice and similar to Scotland there. And the country is quite a lot covered with forest, despite what I just showed you, all those pictures. But all the cities are on the sort of left-hand side, the west coast and the north. Whereas this distillery is on the east coast. And actually, up until recently, there's a huge mountain range between Taipei, the capital city, which is sort of top middle of that map, and this area where the distillery is. And they've actually built Asia's longest tunnel to go through that mountain range. And that's opened up the East Coast a wee bit. But the East Coast is beautiful forests and, pure water, clean air, and particularly this area. It's called the Yilan Valley. And actually in the old days, because they all speak Mandarin now, but in the old days before all that link with China happened, the Taiwanese language this area is called Kavalan. So that's the name, the reason for the name for here. So they're getting water from the mountain ranges, really pure air as well here. And the other good thing is because it's sort of off that coast of China, apparently a wind will come out of Siberia, come out of the east of Russia, cycle round past Japan, and then sort of head into Taiwan in the northeast. So in the winter, they get slightly colder nights than is standard in Taiwan. And that helps with the aging, again, the balance of so I just said that. Where we are. Okay. And I also said this as well. So it took them 9 months to get the distillery, and they started officially making their first new make in March 2006. So not been going for that long if we're talking about some of the sort of whiskies that people might be used to. But the thing that's really important here, remember the heat and humidity, is the speed of aging. Now, this whiskey ages 3 to 4 times faster in Taiwan because of the heat and the humidity. So 1 year there is worth 3.5, let's say, years in Scotland. So Taiwan and Kavalan have actually achieved tons of recognition, awards, got loads in the range, really delicious, well-matured whiskies in a relatively short space of time. Okay, so this one, just in case people are already trying it, sorry, I'm a bit behind with the tasting. Sorry, what smells are you getting?
It's definitely like really rich. It's got that kind of quite fruity, but like raisiny sort of character on it, on the nose.
So this one's just 40%.
I'd also say it's got like a bit of like a kind of roasted tropical fruit, like roasted pineapple or something like that in it. Like definitely
Perfect.
in comparison with this one where you've got that lovely freshness, and going back to that now, that smells like sort of toffee apple, and then going on to this one, it's that full, real roasted sort of style.
Yeah, it's kind of juicy, this one, isn't it? Perfect tasting notes, though. So this is aged in the tropics, and whenever a whiskey is aged in the tropics, and if people hand you whiskies in the future and you don't know where they're from, if you get this kind of roasted tropical fruit stroke coconutty kind of flavor, then do maybe kind of guess that it's aged in a hot country, because tropical aging will give you these extra juicy flavors. But this one has been finished in a port cask. So that's where your raisiny, sort of spicy notes are coming through on this, and all that extra thickness. So the standard Cavalan is aged in a bunch of, sort of refill casks, and it is much more sort of pineapple, coconut, sort of mango, papaya, those kind of flavors with vanilla. This one then, because they put it in a port cask to finish, has just got this extra sort of juicy richness and a bit more oomph to it.
So I was going to say, there's like a red fruit note on it as well, but I was like, is that my brain playing tricks on me? But like,
yeah, no. And usually with fruit, I think in whiskey, you're really aiming to try and pick one sort of sector of fruit. So you either say tropical fruit, or you say orchard fruit, or stone fruit, or ripe fruit, and that you don't usually have multiple styles together. And so this one is cheating, basically. It's confusing you. But lots and lots of texture and flavor here. Tobacco, yeah, absolutely brilliant tasting note. So that port cask, of course, is going to be giving you this extra kind of also savory, spicy, as well as the red fruit kind of notes. So think of all those port flavors. So yeah, absolutely, with the older cask as well. This one's just 40%, so you probably notice it's a bit smoother, but also I think quite often whiskies aged in hot countries have an extra sort of layer of smoothness to them. And that's partly because, I'm sure everyone's experienced this, but when you've been on holiday and you try and taste a spirit, the alcohol always seems more aggressive, even if it's a brand that you drink, even if you brought it with you from home and it's your bottle that you know is perfectly smooth back home, but you bring it to somewhere hot and you open it and you're like, oh, alcohol's a bit more shouty, isn't it? And that's just because of the heat. Okay, alcohol is evaporating quickly and then getting up your nose. And so imagine if you are a person, a taster at a distillery, deciding when your whiskey's ready to bottle. You're looking for a smoothness. Now that smoothness happens much slower, even as everything's aging faster. It's harder to feel like you've definitely guaranteed smoothness in Taiwan because of the heat. So if they bottle it over there and they think it's smooth when it's hot, by the time it comes here, it feels really smooth. And also sometimes a bit closed as well. So let it warm up in your mouth. And I've got guava and honey melon. Yeah, absolutely. So people are getting those tropical notes as well as combining with those more savory winter port notes. So really rounded whiskey, this one.
It's very silky, this one.
Yeah.
It's very just like the finish on it as well. It's really lengthy, but it's like it still feels very silky in the mouth, like on the finish as well. Yeah. And just like seductive in that sense, I suppose.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I mean, this is probably about the same age in actual years as the last whiskey. So this has been aged for 4.5 to 9 years. The last one was 4.5 to 5.5. So the youngest whiskey in both of these last two is the same, but can everyone feel how this one tastes? You can get a lot more tannin, a lot more barrel in this one. Yeah, and that's because it's really the equivalent of kind of heading towards a 15-year-old's amount of barrel extraction because of the heat and the speed of aging over there. But for anyone who's a bit of an entrepreneur, and if anyone's thinking, oh, this is a great idea, she just said building a distillery is a dreadful idea for making money because you've got to wait for the stuff to age. Yeah. But then she said you can go to a hot place and build a distillery and it'll age in no time. Yes, sorry, that doesn't actually work for you commercially, because I'm sure everyone's heard of the thing called the angel share. You lose a bit of whiskey every year out of a cask while it's aging. So in Scotland, Scottish climate, it's 1.5 to 2% a year, which is pretty rubbish. You know, I'm sure you can imagine after opening a cask after 20 years, you're like, where has most of it gone? This is dreadful. Who is stealing this? But in a hot country, and I used to think, okay, well, hold on, I know maths, I know a bit of science. It's aging 3 to 4 times faster. Okay, so let's expect it to be, let's say, 4 times more than it would be in Scotland. So Scotland's 1.5 to 2% a year. So we're thinking, okay, 8% angel share maximum per year. That sounds too much. That sounds awful. But actually, what these guys discovered when they built the distillery and started aging their whiskey, it's 12 to 16% a year. And they're like, no, this is hideous.
That's
So
crazy amount.
yeah,
Oh,
tons more than you want. Okay, so things are just flying out of that cask there. So devastating. These guys, yeah, so they started trying to control. Now they don't want to cool down their distillery. They're not trying to make fake scotch in Taiwan, so they're going to try and try and air condition. Obviously, air conditioning is really dry as well, so that would just increase evaporation. So what these guys do is they actually, they open the windows to try and catch that Siberian wind coming through off the winter. But they also spray water into the air. They have sort of misters, and they wet the floor. So they increase the humidity in the warehouse, which slightly decreases the evaporation, but without changing the temperature and everything else that's happening in the cask. So they're now sitting on 10 to 12% a year, which is a little bit more reasonable.
But if you've got, say, like a 500-litre barrel, I've just done a calculation, and you're losing 12% a year. That's like 60 litres a year. That's a crazy amount of whiskey.
It's rude, isn't it? So rude.
Oh,
furious.
The Yankees have had enough.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk about Indian whiskey later, and they have the same problem there. And the guys in India, they don't just make this joke at Kavalan, but at the Indian distillery, they're like, well, we have more gods, don't we? So, I guess. And you're like, oh, well, okay. Sure.
Fair enough.
So Kavalan are trying to do things to sort of minimize this a wee bit, but like I say, they don't want to sort of change the climate and change that kind of thing that's happening. So if you're thinking, I can make tons of cheap whiskey really quickly, you can make it quickly, but it will not be cheap. Okay, because every obviously liter that you lose is profit out the window, off with the angels. So just in case anyone's wondering. Sorry to talk about quick. Oh, you're gonna.
I was going to say, I know, like in the Caribbean, in rum making, they have a similar kind of problem, but they're more at that sort of 7 to 8%. I didn't realize that in Taiwan it was as high as that. That's
Well, so rum is 2 to 3 times faster, and this is 3 to 4 times faster. So it's another bunch more. So not great. But like I say, it's all working out. The whiskey's delicious, and obviously, as you lose volume in a cask, that's when you're creating this lovely silky texture that you were talking about. That's what happens.
And I suppose you concentrate it as well. I suppose it's a little. I guess it's a little bit like when you dry your on winemaking, and they do the ripasso styles of wine in Italy, and they're drying the grapes out. You're concentrating all those flavors by evaporating the water in there. And whilst it's a lot harder to make wine from that, and you get a lot less from it because you're crushing essentially raisins which don't have much juice in there, you get a much more concentration and richness in those grapes.
Yeah, I actually was thinking of gravy. It's not quite as sexy, but you start off sometimes with quite a watery gravy, and then particularly like you've roasted a chicken, you pull out the chicken and you let the chicken sit, and then all the juices come out the chicken, and then you just boil that up, and that will start off quite watery, but if you boil it for long enough, and it smells delicious coming off, so it's both water and the smell coming off it, but it gets thicker and it gets silky, and that's so. I think
that's
of gravy.
Gravy, really, isn't it? You don't want to watery gravy.
No. So whiskey's like gravy. There we go. That's the takeaway.
That's a new comparison.
Yeah, sorry.
Like gravy.
So just in case anyone's sort of wanting some more facts rather than me randomly being silly about Kavalan, they don't grow much barley over there, so they have to ship most of it over. There's a wee bit of local barley, but not very much. So think of the countries nearby that are growing barley. Obviously, there's tons grown in Europe. Australia grows quite a lot. So they ship it all over. This whiskey and all the current range of Kavalan is all unpeated. Because the style of whiskey that they like in Taiwan, actually I forgot to mention at the beginning, one of the reasons they decided to build a single malt distillery is Taiwan is one of the biggest countries in terms of value in Asia, importing single malt Scotch. So them deciding to build a whiskey distillery wasn't kind of out of nowhere. It's because they absolutely love single malts. Places like China and India are importing tons more volume of Scotch, but it's usually cheaper blends. Whereas Taiwan, for them, it is super expensive single malts, mostly Speyside style. So the peaty flavor isn't something that they're that keen on quite yet. So all the barleys are unpeated. Currently, they did ship over about 3-4 years ago some peaty barley just to have a play. So I wouldn't be surprised with some releases coming out later, either this year or next year. that are peated, which I'm super excited about. I did taste some 2-year-old samples a couple of years ago, and they were lovely. So we'll see what goes on there. And then their fermentation is temperature controlled again, because it's hot. You can't let it get too hot, else it makes those bitter flavors. And they have to use yeast that are used to a warmer climate. So they're using French and South African yeast, actually, combination of the two, to make really fruity flavors. They want a fruity spirit. Okay. So that's the sort of main production process. I think I might have a picture actually of something I've stopped. Oh yeah, there's what I've just told you. And these are the beautiful stills. So these were, as you said before, made in Scotland for sites, stills, but then shipped over in pieces. You can sort of see where they've been stitched together at the distillery, shipped over and stitched together over there. And this is their original 2 pairs of stills, but Cavalan in 2015 was awarded Best Single Malt in the World at the World Whisky Awards for one of their single cask bottlings. And the year after that, they got the Best Single Cask Single Malt for a different bottling. And so the owners got quite excited, and they did a big expansion project. So they originally had 2 pairs of stills, and the following year after that award, they doubled it to 4 pairs of stills. And then the year after that, they took it up to 10 pairs of stills. Wow. So this distillery is now able to produce 9 million litres of alcohol per year, which puts it in the top 5 single malt distilleries in the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's an awful lot they're producing. Well, I'd say that's a lot that they can actually make, but in terms of the aging process, obviously they're losing a lot of it as well. But a lot. That is a really big production.
So they're not fully utilizing it all. Like last year, they said they were just using about 60% of it. So it's just less than 6 million litres. So we'll see what's happening, and obviously they're playing with some peaty stuff now, and they're doing it a little bit. So so interesting, but ready for expansion, ready for becoming a big successful, and obviously coming out of nowhere, building the first distillery in your country and not even sure if it's working, to suddenly become one of the biggest in the world. It's a big step.
Yeah, definitely. And good to see that that there is the capacity as well, that for people to, or for distilleries that aren't in those predominant whiskey making countries to like expand and go further with it as well. And especially if they've won awards, I'm sure that might have upset a few people if Taiwan have come kind of out of nowhere almost and then won 2 awards for the best single malts in the whole world.
I think the guys in Scotland love them. They're super interested by what's happening, and I think everyone in Scotland would love to be able to. And obviously, you can't by law, but like ship the cask somewhere and see what happened if it's put in a hot place and all that kind of stuff. So I think people are super interested in them. Also, one of the consultants involved right at the beginning was the late Dr. Jim Swan. So he obviously helped these guys really, get everything right. And obviously, I think also keep Scotland on side. So they definitely feel like there's a Scottish connection to this distillery. Now, people might be wondering about the range of Cavalan. Now, the reason it's difficult for them to make a range based on age statements, which, if you start up a new distillery in Scotland, you release one quite young, then you release a bit of an old one, then your standard SKU after a few years becomes maybe your 10-year-old, and then you have a 12-year-old that's finished in a different thing, and a 15-year-old and a 21-year-old. These guys can't do that because of the angel share and the speed of aging. So the way that these guys make a range of whiskies is by using different casks, and they buy all the casks that you can think of, and actually there's whoever you are, the amount of casks that you can list in your head. There's always more. So they bought all of them, and they put this new make spirit into all of them, and then see what happens. And then they either combine them together like this one. So this is a few different refill casks together. So there'll be some bourbon, some sherry, some wine casks in here, and then finished in that port cask. Or they bottle them as single cask versions. So I know you guys have some of what's called the Solist range, don't you? Yes. Which is a single cask strength whiskey. The Cavalan, these are the ones that are winning these best whiskey in the world awards. These are what Cavalan are really well known for.
You have in the cage behind me. I don't think you'll be able to see it properly. This one here, the Cavalan, the soloist Pedro Jimenez.
Oh my God, yes. So Pedro Jimenez is a sweet sherry, everyone, and it's absolutely incredible, really raisiny and puddingy. And they buy these casks, and it's really rare to see a whiskey aged in those. And if you do see a whiskey with PX on the label or Pedro Jimenez on the label, it's usually a finish. So they've aged it in American and then finished it in PX casks. Now, what Cavalan do is different. For all these single cask whiskies that they make, they are all aged entirely in that ridiculously rare and expensive cask. Wow. And it's first fill. Okay, so that's come fresh over from Jerez and then been filled with spirit.
That's why that's £475. So
it is, and it's Yeah, it's also why if you took it out of the box, you'd see the color, which is essentially like treacle, and you'd be like, "What? This is crazy." Okay, so if you really want to geek out on what different casks do to different whiskies, Cavalan's a great range to play with, because they do this for you. Okay, so there's another picture of the distillery. I've got lots of stories, but I'm worried I'm talking too long about one country.
So can I just ask quickly, why is it called the Concert Master, this one?
Oh yeah, good question. So they have a bit. So apart from single malt, the other thing that Taiwanese people seem to love, from Europe particularly, is Viennese sort of classical music, opera. Yeah. So their standard single malt is called Classic, and then this one's called Concert Master, and then they have another one called Podium, another one called Conductor, and then that range of single cask strength is called Soloist or Solist, and that is without the second O, so soloist, is apparently a Viennese, what we'd call a soloist in English. So there's a bit of a musical theme to some of the range, not all of them though. Some of them don't have a musical theme, and it's just an extra sort of thing that they love. So it's nice. It was weird because I was at the airport in Taipei, and there's direct flights to London and direct flights to Paris, kind of as you'd expect. Direct flights to Amsterdam, that kind of thing. Direct flight to Vienna, and I was like, "Oh, well, that's okay, sure."
It's random.
Yeah, I didn't expect that. I didn't know why. But yeah, so turns out it's a thing that they love. Yeah. Right, so now we're taking a tiny wee plane though, because we did the big plane from Ireland to Taiwan last time. But now, and actually the south of Japan, the islands that are not actually on this map, the ones that dot further down, are only an hour away from Taiwan. When I was there, I made a mistake, to be honest, because I had read that Taiwan was not a great place to have a holiday. It's too city-ish. There was not really beaches, blah, 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 blah. There's loads of typhoons. And when I was flying all the way out there, I was like, well, I'm taking a week's holiday after I fly all that way, and I'll have a holiday somewhere. But I want to be warm, and I want it to be beachy and lovely. And so I had, once the Cavalan trip was finished, I planned to go to the south of Japan, to the Okinawa Islands, those islands that are south of here. And I flew there. Now, while traveling around Taiwan, though, with the guys from Cavalan, I realized that there are amazing beaches and it's utterly stunning and there's amazing food. And I had booked to leave immediately, which I think was actually really rude. But, I just really needed to use the beach.
Yeah.
So, and actually, there's a longer story here, but our flight ended up being cancelled to Japan because it was a typhoon. But then because our insurance refused to give us any money, because I was like, a typhoon is not an act of God or an unexpected thing. They're perfectly common in Taiwan in the summer. So it's a standard weather occasion. But the insurance wasn't having it. So they wouldn't refund us any of our hotels or anything else that we booked in Japan. So we got on a very rickety old plane through the typhoon. And we got a flight, and it was weird. And we ended up in Japan, and we had our expected holiday. But I kind of think definitely next time I go, I'm going to stay in Taiwan on holiday because it's beautiful. And there absolutely are beaches. So whatever guidebook I was reading, don't
we don't pay attention to that.
No. Furious. Anyway, so we're moving to Japan, and like I say, not very far. And I show this map because a lot of people, when asking about Japanese whiskey, it's been a category now for almost 100 years. It's 1923 they started making it. So there's lots of distilleries there now. Then there's some distilleries that have started and finished and closed down already. Then there's other distilleries that are being built. People quite often say, "Oh, well, how many distilleries are there in Japan?" And I'm like, well, there's not an easy answer to that question because we're still drinking whiskies from distilleries that have closed down and been closed down for years. There are distilleries that are technically open, but we're not drinking any whiskey from there yet because it's not aged enough. So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer. And this used to be my really useful map, which I knew one was missing from here. And now this map is massively out of date, and there's probably another 10. So I just need to make it clear to everyone that there's loads of distilleries in Japan and lots happening over there. So that's what this picture is there for. Excuse me. I tried to move my microphone out of the way, so I wasn't sneezing.
It's interesting. It's interesting looking at that map because there's some real kind of like, from my point of view working, there's some real recognizable names on there. Obviously, Yamazaki, Hakushu, with things like white oak as well, and like these are all things that we and you know that we're familiar with. And yeah, going back to when we did the Japanese tasting, it was really interesting learning that actually it's how, you know, there's a couple of these distilleries that are owned by one particular company, and things, you know, like how they kind of work all together, or don't work together. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think you'd expect, you know, a bit to have with a country with loads of distilleries like this, you'd expect them to maybe be heading down, you know, the Scottish route of everyone trading different casks of different flavors between themselves to make blends, because they all want to make blends, and they still don't. So it's super interesting. But the other thing that I like pointing out about this map is the two most northern, and there is one now that's more northern apparently, that we're not drinking whiskey from yet, but it's up in the very north of this island up here. But currently on that map, the two most northern are the ones that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the second one actually specifically. But we're going to talk about the Nikka company. So Nikka was set up by this guy here, called Masataka Taketsuru, and he's known as the father of Japanese whiskey. So if you've heard the story, it's quite a big long story. I'm going to try and just give you the main points. But he's the guy who came to Scotland in 1918, met and married a Scottish lady, learned how to make whiskey, and then went back to Japan. And he built the first whiskey distilleries over there. Now, the first one he didn't build for himself because he didn't have enough money. So he built Yamazaki, which was Japan's first whiskey distillery in 1923. And then he left after 10 years and set up his own company, which is called Nikka. Now, some people might say, oh, no, there was definitely people making whiskey in Japan before 1923. And I'd be like, yes, whiskey. Okay. Because Japanese people were super excited from the 1850s onwards about tasting anything foreign overseas, particularly from Europe. And whiskey was a big thing. Everyone was desperate to try it. There was hardly any coming over. And so they started making their own whiskey quite quickly in around the 1850s. But they didn't know how to make it. They didn't know what it was made from. It was just, you know, bottles shipped over, or even casks sometimes. So they just got their own national alcohol, shochu, which is their distilled spirit. And, you know, made it brown and put the word whiskey on it. Okay, so that was kind of the early Japanese whiskies. So until Taketsuru, whiskey in Japan wasn't what anyone else would call whiskey. Okay, and I'm not sure if anyone's been to Thailand and had whiskey. I know I keep mentioning Thailand. Or India, some areas in India that will make a lot of whiskey. Oh my God, I think I'm going to sneeze again. I never sneeze. What's going on? Okay, it's fine. Yes, so there's a lot of countries around the world. If something isn't your native product, a product that you have heritage making, quite often you won't have any rules about how it needs to be made. Whereas obviously Scotland, Ireland, we have tons of rules about how whiskey needs to be made because it's a product that we've had for ages. But we don't have any rules here for how sake needs to be made, for example, because we don't care. It's not our thing. But there's tons of rules in Japan about how sake needs to be made. Okay, so it's how everything works. And so Taketsuru, like I say, built the first, what I'm going to call the proper whiskey distillery in Japan, and obviously, you know, shared his knowledge, and other people started building distilleries too. So what we're going to taste tonight is actually his second distillery. It's called Miyagikyo. Thank you. And he built this to be a bit more of a Speyside style of flavour. His first distillery was that one far up in the north on an island next to the sea. So it, unsurprisingly, made coastal or islandy style whiskies. Whereas this one, because he was trying to make blends, he wanted lots of flavours, contrasting flavours ideally. He built this one in an area further south, kind of further away from the sea, up in what feels like the Highlands. Okay, so this is designed to feel like Speyside or Highlandy down here. So he built it in 1969. And here is the map again. Sorry, never-ending maps with me. But this is where it is. You can go and visit it. It's about 2 hours, if you fly to Tokyo, 2 hours north by bullet train, and then about an hour kind of windy road through sort of hills and valleys and glens and stuff. It's, I mean, kind of, it's not really a great logistical place to put a distillery. For shipping in, the roads are tiny and really windy. So for shipping in barley and shipping out whiskey, it's not really the best place to put a distillery. But Taketsuru decided on this site after tasting rivers around Japan for 2 years, and then waited for a river he thought that reminded him of Scotland. And this is the site. Okay, so this is where he built it. Now, one of my favorite things about this distillery is the name. Miyagi-kyo is a bit of a terrifying word when you first see it. I'm not sure everyone can see. But there's lots of syllables there. British people quite often will get tangled up in all those syllables. And I've heard people pronounce it all kinds of ways. But luckily, there's a cheat. So kyo in Japanese means valley. Okay, so the end of Miyagi-kyo. So if you were sort of breaking this down, it would, in Scotland, for example, be called Glen Miyagi. Miyagi is the name of the territory. And this is a valley in Miyagi. So if anyone remembers Karate Kid, then Mr. Miyagi, I'm not sure if anyone's watching, then Mr. Miyagi, so start off saying Miyagi and then say Kyo at the end, and then you won't get tangled up. Okay, so just a little hint. And hopefully I'm not sure if anyone's smelling this so far. So this one does have a wee bit of sherry cask in it. Majority sherry cask, but a wee bit of bourbon, ex-bourbon and American oak in it as well. Okay. So it's not going to be quite as wintry as the last one. The port cask kind of isn't there, the extra spice you get from a port cask, and the extra tannin you get from a port cask. But here it's much more honey, raisin, apricot kind of flavors coming through. It's 45% this one, so we're jumping a wee bit in the ABV. But then on the palate, you should be getting real herbaceousness. Lots of foresty flavors, lots of green pine, tiny little hint of smoke. I'm not sure anyone gets that. It's only wee.
Yeah.
But it's a really lovely backbone to it.
I got the smoke slightly on the nose, but I think it's because we've come from the Cavalan. So when we tasted this before in a Japanese lineup, the smoke is really very, very subtle. Doesn't come through, but I think we've come from the Cavalan. That smoke was a little bit more prominent on it. Yeah. And for me, it's got that quite kind of floral style to it. The kind of like the stone fruits and that kind of like the lighter sort of stone fruits and like a floral element on it. But yeah,
there's tons happening in this one. Tons and tons. So this is the distillery. And I always think, when I'm tasting it, the greenness that I'm tasting is essentially this picture. It's, like I say, absolutely beautiful. And in the middle of tons of valleys, so really, really far away from anything else. And just beautiful. And I always joke that it looks really Scottish. And the first time that I went there, I got off the bus that they'd put, got us there on. And it looked even more Scottish because it was raining so hard. I couldn't see any buildings at all. So beautiful place. And the interesting thing, compared to Cavalan particularly, obviously the climate here is actually really similar, much more similar to Scotland. So Taketsuru, I mean, the reason that Nikka's two distilleries are situated in the north out of most of the other distilleries in Japan is because he was trying to replicate Scottish conditions. So when he's looking for river water that's like Scotland, or climates or valleys, that's all what he was going for. So other people in Japan, when they built their distilleries, they hadn't been to Scotland usually. They were just using Taketsuru's knowledge. So they didn't really, consider the water or consider that kind of thing. So yeah, here it's about 1.5 degrees warmer on average through the year, comparison to Inverness. Okay, so if you average it's a bit warmer in the summer and a bit colder in the winter, but averages out across the year, just 1.5 degrees difference. So here you've not got any tropical aging happening, and this whiskey is 10 to 12 years old. On average, there might be some younger and some older in it as well. Okay. I said 45%, and mostly sherry cask, a little bit of ex-bourbon. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Nikka, and again, this links back to the history of when they were blending, is how they make their spirits. And remember at Cavalan, I was sort of saying, they use this yeast strain, and they, these are their stills, etc., etc. Now, what they do at Nikka, both distilleries that Nikka has, is actually change those kind of distilling sort of conditions every time, and spirits production conditions every time. So, one day they use some peated barley and they use yeast strain A, and they'll ferment for 96 hours and they'll distill with these settings, and they'll put that in an American oak cask. And then the following day they'll use heavily peated barley, yeast strain C, ferment for 48 hours, and put that in a sherry cask. Okay, so these guys are changing their methods of production every day to give them more flavors of resulting aged whiskey, so that when they make their blends, they've got loads more options. Because like I said before, Japanese distilleries don't trade amongst themselves. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to everyone.
Yeah.
But super interesting. So this, the Cavalan was the same spirit put into the same barrel, well, lots of different barrel types combined together, but the spirit was the same every time. It's the same yeast, same fermentation, same distillation. This, and it's not all of these, but it could be up to 600 options. And that's how many options Miyagikyo is making, just by changing one variable every time.
It's crazy to think about the amount of different variables with it. And I suppose it kind of helps people understand, I suppose, why Japanese whiskey has become quite limited and why you don't get the sort of same, consistent 12-year-old, 15-year-old, and why they've become, these quite elusive sort of bottles to get hold of. And I know Nika recently have changed that. There was the pure malt they did, and they've changed the sort of blend slightly of it. And, I think it seems to be quite a common practice that actually they're quite experimental in a way. But also very meticulous. It never feels like they've experimented and they've gone too far and it's gone off balance and they've gone a bit crazy. It seems like they've experimented and know how to balance that out and how to kind of take an element of this and an element of this and put this together to make something else, and then maybe add a bit of this, but only if it's kind of needed.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing how much they adhere to tradition as well. So this it's ways of experimenting that, for Nika, they wouldn't probably much consider aging in, I don't know, random type of oak or random something else that wasn't used traditionally in Scotland. Whereas, for Nika, everything's about doing things the way it was done in Scotland, but just doing all of those things at a couple of places. The other thing I think that's quite fun about this picture is, people are like, well, there's loads of warehouses. This shortage is obviously some kind of fake thing to drive up the price and make everyone want it. Just in case you are thinking that, those warehouses are all teeny tiny. So Japan has a problem with earthquakes, as I'm sure most people are aware. And so what distilleries don't want to risk is they end up with a whiskey waterfall. So they actually just stack the barrels too high. So these are dunnage warehouses, same as Scotland, all earthen floors. But it's one barrel lying on its side on the floor, one row of those, and then one barrel stacked on top, and that is it. That is as high as it goes. So, you kind of duck to get into the door of the warehouse, and you look in and you're like, there's hardly any casks in here. And that's the same with all of the warehouses. So while it looks like a lot of buildings, and if those are warehouses in Scotland, you probably maybe have 6, a few more stacked high. So yeah, no, there's not much at all, unfortunately. Yeah. But how's everyone getting on with the flavor? I think, like I say, the complexity. I mean, you were saying about, the Japanese being experimental as well, but it's also why they're winning so many awards. If you look at a single malt from Scotland, for example, you've used one peat level because that's the peat level you always use. You've used one yeast strain because that's the yeast strain you always use. You fermented for this long because that's how long you ferment for. These are your still settings, and these are the casks you use. So then you release a single malt and you're using the same spirit, and you've just got the tiny little bit of variation that you get between casks to mix together. Whereas here, it's still a single malt. It follows all the rules, but they've used a different yeast strain every time, and they've used different peat levels and different distillation settings. So there's lots of layers of flavor here, which I think is what they're going for.
I think, I really like this. You said at the beginning there's that sort of subtle smoke on it, I think, because we've come from kind of other quite bold kind of flavored whiskey, but there's a subtle sort of smoke on it that is, I think, one of my favorite types of smokiness. It's that kind of slightly sweet, almost like barbecue style smoke. I love that sort of smoke on a whiskey, but balanced really nicely. It's not overpowering, it's not too much, and I can see on the tasting notes that you've got fruity, floral, honeyed. And it's that honey flavor for me that kind of really comes through, but not in that sort of real, confected style honey. That sort of rich style, the honey that slightly floral style as well. It's very delicate. I think that's the best way of describing it.
Complex and elegant. Yeah.
No,
it's a lovely one. And the smokiness, like I don't usually notice it that much compared to what I'm starting, obviously, because it's come after the Cavalan. But I think it's a herbaceous smoke as well. I do a different tasting where I talk about smoke, and sometimes I'm saying, like, you've walked into a cottage that has a log fire. That's one smell of smoke. But if you try and set a fire in a forest using fresh green wood, the waxy resinous smoke that comes out of that is very different from the smoke you get inside from dried wood. And this is very much the green resinous smoke to me. So it's quite nice. If people aren't used to smoky whiskies, it's quite a nice one to ease yourself into the flavour.
It reminds me slightly of Macmira's smoky whiskey, their Spence Rock, and they smoke it purposely on juniper twigs and spindles that they've collected from the forest floor, and the kind of the effect you get about it's a peated malt, that one, so 100% peated, but not as delicate as this one, but the effect you get is that you get this lovely, quite complex style of smoke, and that herbaceousness you were talking about, and that kind of piney freshness in it as well. Which it makes it quite interesting with smoke. I think sometimes people sort of think of peated whiskey and they think automatically of the big hitting things like Ardbeg, which you open it and you can smell right across the room, and it's got that really medicinal sort of style smell. But there's a lot of kind of elements you can play with smoke, and even depending on how you sort of smoke, how you peat that barley. It can really.
The Japanese palate is not like the Scottish palate, and the Scottish palate, and I think because of the extra coldness, maybe there are quite a lot of wet feet. Traditionally, old days in Scotland, looking for flavors to warm you up, flavors to give you a bit of energy, give you a bit of a kick, slap you in the face a little bit, and obviously some of the smoke there is aiming for that. The Japanese palate, when Nika started trying to make started trying to make smoky whiskey in Japan, they were like, what is this is no, because their palate's much more elegant. They like much more fruity stuff, much more floral stuff as well. So so the smoke obviously is very much tailored to the palates that are making it, I think, as well. So
interesting. If anyone's still got any left of the previous two, even just smelling them on the nose, going back to the Drumshambo, it's got that, like when you said about banana porridge, almost like banana bread as well on it, and then smelling it in comparison to the Cavalan. It's interesting how you smell and taste one of them, and then smell and have to taste something else, and then go back to it, how it kind of can affect it. Because usually when we've tasted this one, we've never really detected the peat that much in it, and it seemed to just suddenly jump out at me today. So it's always something good to kind of keep in mind with that.
I think that's the fun thing about tastings, is even if you tasted a whiskey 30 times before, putting it after something else that you're not usually putting it after, it will give you completely different notes, and that's the amazing depth of the flavors in whiskey that you might not notice. I always get this flavor from this one, but then because you've had a different lunch, or it's a different temperature outside, or you've had something else before it, you might pick up some like in perfume, you get the sort of top notes, and then you get the sort of the middle notes and the base notes, and those ones might be hidden sometimes because of the top notes so in your face. It's quite nice to explore different angles of things. So where are we going now? We've gotten a plane and we've come back. We've flown, let's say, into Aberdeen, and we've driven a wee bit, which would be the easiest way to do that. This is completely the wrong slide. What am I doing? We're not going there at all. We're going here. Sorry. I was like, no, we're not tasting that. We're going to America. So we're going from Japan to America. So actually, that's quite a good plane ride. We're going the right way around the world. Yes. So we're going to taste some American whiskey now. So this one's mixed with Sarah Mash. And it is... We're straying away from single malt again. So we have, obviously, the first whiskey was different grains. Then we've had 2 single malts. And now we're going to a whiskey that's American style. So classic American style grains would be corn or rye. So rye and malted barley were all taken over to America by people sort of moving over there and emigrating. Rye grew much better in America. Barley grew much better in Canada. In simple terms, obviously, I'm sure there's some grown in both areas, but that was kind of the thing. So original American whiskies were made mostly from rye, or maybe some malted barley as well. And it wasn't until a little bit later that people sort of went further into America and found corn. And corn is not a European grain. We didn't have corn. Sweet corn, also known as maize. We didn't have that before. And so then people started using that a lot more predominantly because it's native to that area. It grows really well. And also sweet corn, it's called sweet already. So I'm sure you can imagine the processing that you have to do with malting barley, for example. Rye is a bit of a tricky one to process properly as well. It doesn't make it easy for you. Whereas corn makes it easy. Nice big grain, super soft, already quite sweet. It's done half the work for you already. Okay, so people obviously started focusing on making whiskey with corn predominantly, rather than rye or malted barley. So this one's actually a combination of all three of those grains. It's got a tiny wee bit of malted barley in there, and that's actually just for the enzyme that comes after malting that converts starch into sugar. And that means the rye is much easier to play with because that enzyme will convert all the starch in the rye into sugar without you having to try and malt rye, which you can do, but it is
easy, or I can imagine a cost-effective process.
No, and the grains are tiny and they've got super hard husks, and they crush. They clog up your grinder. So you have a special grinder just for the rye because it won't go in with anything else. And then when you ferment, it's foamy, so it kind of spills over like you've chucked shampoo into a jacuzzi. So honestly, it's causing trouble, rye, all the time. But rye gives you amazing sort of nutty, spicy flavors. As I'm sure you can imagine from corn, if you've tasted corn whiskies before, they give you sort of butter. Think of buttered sweet corn, popcorn flavors, some citrus as well. So these are the flavors we're looking for here. And it's a balance between the corn and the rye. So the rye is more savory, like I say, nutty, spicy, and the corn's more buttery and soft and creamy, okay? So this whiskey is another one that's got that sort of lovely texture. And oats gave us a very porridge sort of texture, but that creaminess you get from oats is really similar to the one you get from corn, but the corn one's more buttery, if that helps, okay? Now, the other thing that's specific about American whiskey, particularly bourbons, rye, or this sour mash here, is they have to be aged in brand new charred casks, okay? So obviously most of the whiskies we've had this evening, the first one was ex-bourbon and ex-sherry. Second one was loads of refill casks with then some port finish, obviously been used already for port. And then the Miyagikyo was ex-sherry and an American oak as well. Okay, so vast majority of those casks have all been used before. This is brand new cask. And again, it's about the same age as the first two. It's about 5.5 years old. But you can see the colours are a wee bit darker than those two. And that's because the new cask will give you a lot more colour off it because it's not been used before. But obviously that colour, once it's gone into the first whiskey, then the second guys don't get as much colour from it. So new American oak, initially, it gives you the classic American oak flavors, you know, vanilla, butterscotch, toffee, bit of spice. But actually, brand new American oak that's been charred gives you a burned toast flavor, if you think of it, charcoal heading towards, and also a lot of the kind of wood tannins. So if you look for a little bit of dryness, excuse me, a little bit kind of tea kind of flavors, bitter chocolate, all those kind of flavors. And you get that only from the new oak. Once it's been used once, then your American oak is just giving you the vanilla and the spice and the stuff that we usually talk about with single malt.
See, this I find really interesting because on the nose, I feel like there's so much going on. So that the reason I was sort of smelling it from the bottle as well, it seems like a lot of the sweeter notes, when it's come from the bottle, obviously it's a much thinner top at the top of it than it is on my glass. And the sweeter notes were coming up because in the glass it smelled really resinous and almost very piney, and that's obviously not what you usually expect from American whiskey. You tend to expect it to have those big, quite rich, full-on vanilla-y, quite full, big flavors, even on the nose. So that really threw me at first, but then as it started to kind of come through, there's those elements of like there's tropical, the green kind of notes, there's some like tropical as well, and then you go back to it and you get that lovely hit of vanilla and the baking spice as well. So yeah, that's
a great tasting note. Yeah, well, and this is why this one's actually called a sour mash rather than a bourbon. And so if they'd used at least 51% corn in the mash bill here, this would be called a bourbon. And mixers do have a bourbon, as you can see on the picture. Mixers do have a bourbon, and that has got more corn in it than this one does. Okay, they also have a rye, and to be called a rye, you have to be at least 51% rye in the mash bill. And so this one also doesn't have 51% rye in it either. I've seen someone just ask the percentage of rye versus corn. We don't actually know the exact breakdown because they are able to change that a little bit depending on the grains that have been sent to them for harvest and everything. So it's not kind of exact. But these guys have a good proportion of corn, but not over 51%, a good proportion of rye, but not over 51%, and then a good proportion of malted barley. So if you want to think of it as equal thirds, then I'm not going to stop you. Okay. I just feel like that's the easiest way to look at it. Okay. So usually what the flavors that you were looking for, I think, is what you get from a bourbon. Okay. All that buttery creaminess and that richness, the kind of sweetness. But then quite often there's not the savory side going so much with the bourbon. Whereas that's what the rye is bringing here. And I think everyone's feeling that. Again, green, her base is kind of almost cleansing, kind of strip through the middle. But along with that buttery corn happening. So I love this one because, like I say, mixers do the bourbon, they do the rye, and both of those are delicious whiskies. But for me, this one, that's the kind of almost equal blend of both is super interesting. Like they're blending the grains at the beginning of production. So obviously all the flavors are interacting all the way through making this whiskey. Okay. So yeah delicious. It's
really interesting whiskey. For some reason, I thought then, so I have a habit, for anyone that doesn't know, I have a habit of I like to relate taste and flavors of certain drinks back to things that I can quite easily, like I know quite easily. So there was a wine we've got that when I tasted it, I thought it tasted like apple crumble and custard. And that was my tasting note. Obviously, a professional term, that's not really what you should do. But for me, I was like,
I think it's better. I actually find those tasting notes better than the ones that professional tasters use, because hopefully everyone has had apple crumble and custard. Yeah. And so you can link to that. And obviously everyone knows what's in it, so you can break it down to the single words if you like. But you've just done a really complex tasting note in 2 seconds. Well done.
That's how I like to think of it, but WSET would probably argue otherwise. So, but this for me, it had a sort of, I know it's obviously sour mash, but it does have that slight sort of sour ting on it. And it almost reminded me of like sort of sour sweets, where they're kind of, you get that bit of sweetness, but you get that real sort of zinginess as well. And then that kind of freshness then that afterwards. Yeah. So that's what it reminded me of completely. That sort of sour sweet, where it's not actually that sweet. The sweet's not actually that sweet or sugary. It's actually quite like,
yeah. Well, I think a combination of the tannin from the Newark can everyone feel their palate's really dry after this one. The flavor's still there, but obviously 2 whiskeys ago, the Taiwanese one, I remember how juicy that was and just kept on the palate, and it felt really rich. This stays on the palate as a flavor, but it feels almost like menthol. You know, when you breathe in, if you've got menthol, after it kind of freshens your mouth. So the flavor stays, but it doesn't feel thick anymore. And that's partly because of tannins, but my mouth is watering now. Okay. And that's again the tannins coming from this new wood, which, you know, if you're using a second-hand cask, it's been used already for American whiskey, those tannins have all gone into this whiskey. That's the point. Okay. So those tannins make this whiskey, I think, more for me, maybe a better before dinner kind of thing as well. If you're thinking the aperitif style drinks. And combined with the spiciness and the savoriness of the rye, it does feel sour, and it's not technically, you know, there's no acid in it. There's a big long story about why Americans call things sour mash, and I'm going to try and do it real quick. But basically, it's if you've broken one of the laws of bourbon and rye. So bourbon and rye have tons of laws they have to follow to be called a bourbon or a rye on the label. Sour mash has a few, but if you've broken the mash bill law, for example, which we have here, we've not got 51% corn, we've not got 51% rye. So the best name that they can use on the hierarchy of names of American whiskey is sour mash here. Okay. And it does link to a traditional process when people first went to America and they were trying to make booze over there. And obviously in the old days, in the old world, you'd be like, well, I'll use this fermentation barrel that my granny, used, and her granny before her. And so, you know that you chuck some crushed up grain that you've boiled into there, it will do the thing that you want it to do in a few days. So you go over to the new world, you didn't bring the barrel with you, obviously that's just silly, you made a new barrel over there, but you chucked in your crushed and boiled up grain like you do at home, and it didn't ferment. It went weird and furry and pussy, and it didn't work. Okay, so people were like, oh, they didn't realize there was these microscopic things called yeast that were doing all the work for them. And so one day, they kept trying and it kept going wrong, but then one day they'd have tried and they got it right, because maybe they were under the right type of tree at the right time of year and there was yeast in the air and everything worked nicely. And so what they started doing was keeping back a little side of that fermented mash. And so mash at the beginning of fermentation is called sweet mash before fermentation starts, because it's got sugars in it. Okay. But at the end of fermentation, the mash is called a sour mash, because all those sugars have gone, the yeast have eaten them, and you've essentially made a sour beer. Okay, but if you keep aside a wee bit of your sour beer, distill the rest of it because you need to make some spirit. But the next time you want to start off a fermentation, you've got your sweet mash. You bring out your little vial of the old sour mash, and you use that, and you don't end up with a big pussy furry mess. It doesn't go off. You've put some yeast in there. You don't know about yeast cells. You don't know how this works. You just think it's magic. Okay, and so that's why a lot of American whiskies use the sour mash process. And actually, all of these whiskies use the sour mash process. The vast majority of whiskies that you'll see, American whiskies that you'll see, use the sour mash process, but you don't use the word unless you can't use bourbon or rye. Okay, so it's just a little labeling thing. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. But let me tell you about mixers, because I've not actually given you an introduction to mixers yet. So basically, mixers actually links to one of the oldest American whiskey distilleries that was ever licensed. There were people making whiskey beforehand, but America wasn't organized enough as a country to start giving out licenses. And it was up here in the Pennsylvania area. So sure, you can imagine all the Europeans coming over from the east, landing around here, and then wanting to buy whiskey before they get off in their little wagon. I imagine little men in wagons traveling off further west there. Okay. And I know it sounds like, why would they be wanting to buy whiskey as an essential supply? And it's not just because they were alcoholics. It's because in those days it was your best medicine. Again, new world, you don't know what the plants do. So old world, you're like, oh, I've cut my finger. I know if I, chew up this plant here and stick it on there with some hot water, or go to my local apothecary, they'll sort it out. Over there, you cut your arm and you're like, well, I don't recognize any of these plants. There's no apothecary because there's no cities. And so I'll just die of a skin infection. That's really embarrassing. So you had booze, strong booze. You get a cut in your arm, chuck a little bit of strong booze on that and you're sorted. Okay, stings a bit, but it's all right. So, anyone who's going off into the wilds of a new country, having a cask in their wagon, it must be a wagon, I've decided. I'm sure I'm very fanciful thinking of this. But you must have, as much strong booze as you can afford, essentially, and then want to make it carry on through your journey. So the original distillery was here from 1753. And obviously quite a long time ago, and it went through a bunch of different names, a bunch of different owners. Standard sort of story with American whiskey distilleries. Closed down during prohibitions and wars and reopened and all kinds of stuff. But the main thing is that a guy called Lou Foreman, he bought it in the 1950s, and he changed the name to Michter's after his two sons, Michael and Peter. But then it went to the next couple of generations after him, and it went bust. And the 1980s was a hideous time for American whiskey. America started deciding it wanted, let's say, quantity over quality. And so if you were making quite decent quality whiskey and it was medium priced, you were stuffed unless you could drop the price and drop your quality at the same time. And so this distillery went bust in the 1980s. And luckily for us, two massive whiskey fans from New York decided to regenerate it. But doing that in Pennsylvania would have been super hard at the time. There was no experienced staff there. There was no distillery anymore. It fully closed down. So these guys reopened it in Kentucky, the heartland of American whiskey production, where all the talent is, where all the equipment is, where everything is, and started making this, regenerating this whiskey. So using super historical methods, traditional ways to make whiskey, but it is a modern company, if that makes sense. Okay. So this is how they resurrected it. I won't go into that too much because we're enjoying this. I'll do a separate mixers tasting for you another time. But these guys, and I think a lot of whiskies, and again, these guys are, already successful people in the booze industry. So like Kavalan, they're not building a distillery in the desperate hope that it's going to make them some money. They're already fine. They've already got plenty of money coming in. This is a way of resurrecting this historic brand and making the best possible liquid they can. So these guys, if there's a production method that they're like, well, there's two options here. We can either do it this way, which is what everyone does, and they do it that way because it gets them more yield and it makes them slightly cheaper. Or we can do it this other way. And they're like, well, why would you use the other way? Because it tastes better, but it costs twice as much. We're doing it B. Back to you. That is every single decision that mixers make every time is, does it make it taste nicer? So there's lots of stuff that these guys do compared to other American whiskies that is more expensive, more time consuming, but it makes the whiskey taste better. So, for example, they air dry all their wood outside for 18 to 36 months, so it's seasoned. Wow. Whereas most people dry in a kiln for 3 months, and the wood's then still a bit bitter, the wood's still a bit tannic, the wood's still got sap in it, it's not dried out properly, and you get some kind of green flavors. Whereas these guys age their wood like you would have done in the old days. They also toast their casks before charring. Remember, charring is law. You have to char your cask, but they'll toast their cask first, which is time consuming, difficult. but it opens up the pores in the wood and you get a much nicer flavour much quicker.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a few things that they do. I'm trying to cycle through. I'm talking too long.
I like that thing that cost be damned. Yeah. That's a really good slogan. Like, whatever. I mean, obviously, not every distillery can really sort of live to that type of expectation. But I suppose there are a lot of people out there, a lot of distilleries that are looking to do that, because at the end of the day, if you're making something, I always think it's a bit funny when people kind of go into the whiskey or go into an alcohol industry thinking, it's going to make me loads of money. For some people it does work, but in general, generally speaking, it's not a really lucrative.
And for the amount of hours you put in, not at all.
It takes an awful lot of hard work, and you tend to see the people that are making the money and that are becoming successful are the ones that are putting in the hours and the hard work, and the ones that are really wanting to make a quality product, not actually make money from it. I think when people sort of, I think you tend to see it a little bit, even in some extent, to people that are looking to invest in kind of like whiskies and things like that. The people that really kind of are actually looking to collect because they're so excited about the new release from the new Isle of Skye distillery, or this place, or they're the people that will find and actually really appreciate the whiskies, and as opposed to the people that are like, oh yeah, if I collect some, I'll make some money out of them.
I mean, I think if you wanted to make quick buck out of whiskey, then the 70s was the time to build a distillery, make some cheap stuff and sell it, and you probably would have been fine. But you've missed the boat there probably now.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong in making money out of whiskey, and there are people that they do obviously flip them and stuff, but it's I just think it's quite interesting. I think sometimes people think that the alcohol industry is like, it's going to make me rich, it's going to make me great, but the people that are doing really well in the industry are the people that aren't necessarily bothered about that and are looking at the actual product and going, what do we need to do to make this good, and what do we need to do to get this out there? Because a lot of the big brands are actually very historical now as well.
Yeah, well, sometimes the historical brands, because they went through the 70s, they've almost gone through a stage of, let's cut the costs here, let's make things more efficient, and then everyone whinges about, it used to taste better in the old days, and then they're trying to get back to that now. So there's all kinds of stuff happening. It's interesting. But again, with the mixes, it's absolutely amazing. And I think, like I say, if you're privileged enough to have a comfortable background and don't need the money, then of course you'll be like, what do I like? I like it to taste really good.
That would be the most expensive thing possible.
So this one's one of that. So the mix has got that range of 4 that I showed at the beginning. Like I say, different mash bills for the bourbon, the rye, and the sour mash. And then the fourth one is one called American Whisky, and it breaks the laws even for sour mash, which still has the law of aging in new charred casks. So the American Whisky is aged in refill casks that have held there, and the mix is 10-year-old bourbon. And then mixers also do the age statements. So they do 10-year-olds, 20-year-old, 25-year-old, and 30-year-old whiskies as well. So there's a few things happening, and they're all pretty special. But this is the specifics of the sour mash, in case I haven't told you all of the facts. I didn't tell you the ABV is 43%. I think I told you most of the rest of that, and we obviously talked a bit about the flavour. I think for American whiskey, maybe people have tried lots of bourbons before, maybe people have been getting into rye, but I think sour mash as a category is a little bit unknown. And there's other ways you can be called a sour mash and have broken a different rule. So not all sour mashes will have this mash bill. Some of them, quite a lot of them, obviously the big ones, Jack Daniel's has basically the bourbon mash bill, but it does a sort of charcoal filtration, kind of essentially adding some flavour, which isn't allowed in bourbon. So that's it's called the Lincoln County process. It's their favourite thing. It's their pet thing. So it's what stands them apart. So I think just and I think people thinking the sour mash word is being used a little bit less often now, because people are like, is it sour? I'm not sure I want sour whiskey. do I? So it's just about the process of fermentation. It's not relating to the final flavour. Okay. So we've had a little quick jaunt into America, but looking into American whiskey now, it's almost like starting Scotch all over again, looking at all the different styles happening. There is tons of single malts popping up everywhere, particularly the northern states, because that's where they do grow a bit of barley. Obviously tons of bourbons and ryes and just generic American whiskies as well. So lots happening over there.
I mean, I find in terms of like whiskey, in terms of sort of selling it and the whiskies we've got in store, I find that I can quite easily talk about Scotch. I know my regions, I know kind of roughly flavors of different things, I know how they compare, but bourbon I find a little bit more difficult because I think, the general consensus for bourbon is that American whiskey is that it's, the sort of Jack Daniels, that really popular, quite sort of sweet, quite vanilla-y, the type of whiskey that I think people who don't like whiskey but want to start drinking whiskey would drink. Or I think people not knowing about it kind of assume it's like that, and actually in terms of the range, there is so much that can be done with it. I know they've got quite strict laws about what they can and can't do for certain whiskies, but in a way it gives them quite a bit to sort of work around as well. So
yeah, I mean, I'm the same. I actually entered whiskey, palate wise from American whiskey. I just found it much easier to drink when I was younger. The flavors were to me a bit sweeter, it was a bit smoother, and just kind of was as it is with kind of kids, quite often you don't really want to have bitter flavors, and malted barley is a bitter thing. So people will get into whiskeys in different ways. I think for me it was funny because I was a bartender when I started learning a bit more about whiskey, and I like to categorize things. I did science at uni, so I was like putting things into nice neat boxes. So I was learning cocktails at the same time as learning booze. And for me, I was like, Scotch whiskey, sippy whiskey. Okay, this is the whiskey people spend money. I'm in Edinburgh. I was a bartender in Edinburgh. So Scotch whiskey is sippy whiskey, and all the cocktails I'd learned that were whiskey based all had bourbon in them. So I was like, American whiskey, mixy whiskey. This is how it goes. And then I moved to London and suddenly met some more bourbons. There wasn't that many bourbons available in Scotland, unsurprisingly. And moved to London, started bartending in London. There were suddenly loads more types of bourbon. I was like, oh, look at America. It's a sippy bourbon here. They've made a sippy whiskey. Well, like patronizing. Well done, America, for making a sippy whiskey. Good work. And then I tasted rye, because then rye started coming over, and I was like, yeah, these are definitely the mixy whiskeys. These are harsh and spicy and a little bit terrifying. And so Scotch whiskey, sippy whiskey, American whiskey, mostly mixy, but occasionally, if you're lucky, you find a bourbon that's sippy. And obviously now there are ryes, particularly the Michter's rye, for example, that is absolutely sippy. So all my categories have been blown out of the water. But I think it's how a lot of people still think of American whiskey. They're like, okay, if I'm buying a special bottle, it's going to be Scotch, it's going to be single malt, I'm going to sit and sip it. Whereas if I'm just buying something for a party, then American will be fun because I'm going to chuck some Coke in it. So, yeah.
It's something that I want to do a little bit more studying on. In fact, I've been pestering Jeff because we said like I need to know more about it. And obviously Jeff knows everything about all the spirits in the store.
Everything.
But yeah, it's one of those that I think as a kind of generally as a sort of category, it kind of gets a little bit looked over, and I think people kind of look at sort of Scotch whiskey, or they go, yeah, I'm after a gift, I want a whiskey. And you can quite, they say, oh, I'm kind of open to suggestions. You could quite easily sort of sell them something from Japan or Sweden, or, even some of the more kind of obscure countries that are making whiskey, but American seems still to be that little kind of step too far in a way, that sort of step.
Yeah, it's because of the corn. People are like, no, I want barley, I want malt. I know malt is cool. Malt's classy. And they don't realize it, but they're like, whatever that's got in it, that is not. And there's corn in it, it's delicious. So it's just people getting used to different grains, I think. So Irish is a good stepping stone as well into that. But yes, all right, so now we're going to get back on our little plane. Hopefully everyone has enjoyed the Michter's Sour Mash. And we are going to go to Scotland. So we are sort of carrying on in our easterly direction. We've gone all the way around the world now in some of our planes. And we are going to taste some whiskey from Islay. So, I'm not sure if everyone knows this brand. It is maybe one of the lesser known things coming from Islay, and that's because it is not a distillery. This is actually an independent bottling of Islay whiskies, and there's a whole range of them, and they actually have different distilleries in each one, but they never mix them together. So each one is a single malt, each bottling is a single malt. But if you have, say, an 8-year-old and a 15-year-old and a 45-year-old, that might be 3 different distilleries there. But they do taste all like a family because they're all from Islay. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And I absolutely love Islay. I was just talking before that I went and lived there for 6 weeks just before Christmas. And favorite place ever. And it doesn't always look like that, but even when it doesn't, it's still beautiful. So that's just what I sort of said. So the flavors that these guys are looking for, and they do have lots of casks from Ireland. If they don't taste like a Port Ascaig should taste, they'll bottle them as something else. Okay, they've got a couple of different ranges, this independent bottler. But if it's got some peat in it, but not huge, like we were talking about that TCP kind of overpowering killer peat before, if it's got a balance of fruity flavors, if it's got some herbaceousness in there, some floral flavors as well, balanced with the peat, then that feels like a Port Ascaig. Okay, and Port Ascaig's the port that you sail into when you arrive by boat from Islay, unless the weather's a bit weird, and then you go around to Port Ellen. Okay, so Port Ascaig is your sort of standard port for arriving. It doesn't have a distillery there, although it does have a distillery quite near it. And that's actually what I've just said. Sorry, there's some more pictures of it. Lovely hotel though. So, you know, and it's teeny tiny little village, so absolutely beautiful place to arrive into. I always arrive in the dark when I go to Islay because I've usually got a plane up from London and then driven for a couple of hours like a madman, and then ended up at a ferry. So there's some more pictures of Islay, and yes, the sea does get that blue. It's absolutely incredible. So do go and visit. And probably the place that we'll all be able to visit even earlier than Ireland.
Yes, that's true.
Once travel eases up. So what we're tasting now is a 12-year-old, okay? And obviously aged in Scotland, so not tropical aging here. And this is a limited release that Port Ascaig released last year, and it's called the Autumn Edition. So last year they released 2 12-year-old whiskies, one called Spring and one called Autumn. And again, selected to taste like those seasons and from different places. Okay, so this one actually says, and Port Ascaig is a fun one because it quite often doesn't tell you which distillery it's coming from. A lot of people like to guess. A lot of people like to think they're all the same distillery every time, which they're not. But there are some distilleries, obviously, that produce a lot more, let's say, bulk whiskey than others. So it's sometimes a bit easier to guess than others. But this distillery came the northeast coast of Islay, very close to Port Ascaig itself. So you've only got 2 options there for those of you who know your maps of Islay. And this is just 9 refill American oak hogsheads and 5 Oloroso sherry butts. Okay. And also 3 Solera sherry butts. Now, I'm not sure if everyone is really aware, but quite a lot of the sherry butts that everyone in Scottish whiskey calls sherry butts haven't been used to make sherry. They've just sort of had sherry chucked in them for a little while to sort of season the cask. And then that cask has been shipped to Scotland and called a sherry cask. When something's called a sherry Solera cask, that means that has been used for making sherry and quite often be upwards of 50 years old and will be a bit mushroomy in a delicious way. Okay, so the sherry industry uses casks for aging, but not like we do with Scotch. They sit there for years, sometimes centuries. And the Solera system's a bit complicated, and I don't have time to explain it. But basically, casks don't get thrown away very often and don't need to be thrown away very often. So finding a Solera cask is like, you know, amongst other sherry casks is super, super hard, super rare. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to smell that extra sort of dusty, like I say, heading towards delicious fresh mushroom flavor coming from these Solera casks.
It's that nuttiness as well, because the Solera system, they're all stacked on top of each other, and you often get the sherry under the floor, like the thick layer of yeast that's sounds disgusting. It's
delicious.
But it makes this really lovely, nutty, rich sort of style of sherry, quite bready as well. And you definitely get that in the, like once you get past the sort of smoke element, it's got that lovely, quite rich, that sort of doughy, but like a nutty style bread. Like if anyone that lives in Sheffield, if they've ever had the sourdough, the walnut sourdough from Seven Hills Bakery, that's what I'm thinking right now. So.
Right. We've had Tom guess a distillery. He's definitely got it right out of the 2 that are options. And he's more likely to be right because that's the one that sells the most spirits. So let's say you're right, Tom. I'm not guaranteeing. Mainly because they don't tell us the guys who make this, they don't write it on the thing, obviously, because they're not supposed to. They'll tell us verbally, but usually by the time I come around to talking about it, because they tell us about it before they launch it. And so this was in the autumn, which is 6 months ago. And then by the time I'm like, oh, which one was this again? I can't remember. And because I'm not supposed to say, I'm like, well, it is easier to forget then, isn't it? And then I don't feel like I'm lying. Yeah, I think you're probably right, Tom. But yes, absolutely. You sound like someone who's been to Isla. And yeah, you stand on that northeast coast, whether you're at Kalila or whether you're at Bunnahabhain, and look out. And if you get a sunny day, fantastic. But like I say, if you don't, and you can see, I was at actually the new distillery up there. Oh yeah, so there's a new distillery option called Ardnahoe there, and did some great tours of there. Just not related to my company at all. But if you go to Isla, the tours at Ardnahoe are smashing, and it's brand new. And strong recommend. Just as an aside. But yeah, exactly. So it's not often you're going to get a sort of PT Isla with this type of cask happening. Okay, so obviously Bunna does quite a lot of aging, particularly cask samples in sherry casks, but they don't have the peat option quite often, quite as much as this. Getting these Solera casks is really, really unusual. Okay, so I think it's just such a lovely combo. And just do you taste of autumn?
I mean, when you pour it and you first smell it, it does have that. It's got like that bump, like you stood by a bonfire eating a toffee apple.
That's exactly what they were going for.
Yeah, and it's got that lovely, like rich sort of smell that you do get some of that sort of TCP, but nowhere near as like kind of full on, very kind of like subtly. And actually, when you taste it as well, I think sometimes people kind of think of peated whiskey and Isla, in particular, as being like, oh, well, it's very kind of full on. It's very sort of like bitter in its taste. It's very sort of smoky and drying, and not sort of got that sweetness or balance in it. But this actually on the palate, that smoke is actually a lot more subtle than I'd expect it to be. It does have, I mean, from the Solera sherry, it's certainly got that sort of rich, sweeter sort of element to it.
I think that's the thing about peated whiskies is, firstly, peat dissipates as time goes on. So if you want the peatiest whiskey ever, drink it young. Yeah. If you're the type of person who loves a big age statement but also loves peaty whiskey, you're potentially wasting your money. You should really buy your peatiest whiskies will be at their peatiest when they're really young. Okay. The other thing is that peat will compete with any other flavor that's in there. Okay. So if you're putting in, as most, let's say 90%, let's say 80% of your big peaty whiskies aged in ex-bourbon barrels to let the peat shine through you. But ex-bourbon barrels give you not too much flavor, a bit of vanilla, bit of spice, but not too much heavy stuff happening, so that the peat can be the main flavor, can be very much number one on your palate. You start using some big casks along with the peat, and it feels like the peat just hides a wee bit, and that's because it's fighting, but it's not fighting here because it's beautiful. But it's not able to outshout the other flavors. Basically, the peat is sort of being matched by the flavors from these casks, and it's not something you find often. And it makes, obviously, everything's bigger, but it actually makes the peat feel like it's a bit smaller. Okay, so this is Harriet's favorite so far. Very good.
I think
it's a beauty. Limited though, guys. I'm super sorry that this one was limited. Okay, so we've got some tasting notes as well. So there was just 9,000 bottles of this for the world that were produced last year. But yeah, I'm not sure if anyone's getting that kind of, Wensleydale cheese, cranberries, bacon. There's some fun tasting notes we've got here.
Definitely got
Christmas pudding, of course.
Wensleydale cheese.
Yeah. Cherry tomatoes. I mean, I think that's maybe one too far even for me. Orphan berries. I like it. Sweet, spicy. There's lots happening here, and it's amazing. And those three cask types. We've got one spirit here made very much in the same way every time. So almost like Cavalan I was talking about earlier, making the same spirit every time. But then those three types of cask have just added all these incredible layers of flavor. So an absolute beauty.
It's definitely one of those that's layered and keeps growing. And like I got the smoky bacon on the nose, and then I just on the very finish, I got that really nice like smoky bacon on the end of it. That was
The cherry is a good tasting note actually here. I think that's quite a good, not cherry tomatoes. I mean, fine, but cherry.
I feel like I get that slightly leafy, like that like leafy tomato.
Yeah, no, like when you've picked a tomato, because I've started growing tomatoes the last couple of years, and the smell when you've picked them, almost the vine rather than the tomato itself. That's the flavour. Yeah, I'll agree with you there. I'll let you have that.
But yeah, do you think like, hang on, I've lost my train of thought there.
I
was going to say, I think in whiskey, you said about cherries and red. That's like the red fruit kind of characteristic, and sometimes you obviously do pick that up in those whiskies that are finished in the port casks, which have held, the port wines for a while. But I always feel like red fruits are not something you necessarily associate with whiskey. Obviously, you look at the color of it; it looks quite light, and you taste it. And we touched earlier. You look for the tropical fruits or orchard fruits or things like that. So. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting when you sort of find red fruit flavors in there.
I agree, and actually, I only ever find them in peaty whiskies, which isn't something you'd expect. There's a peaty whiskey that used to be out from Nika. It's called Pure Malt Red, and it's discontinued. There is a little bit of it around. I'm not sure if you guys have any left. But it, again, has this kind of strawberry, raspberry kind of red fruit kind of thing. And it's a wee bit peaty. And it's not something I've ever found much in unpeated whiskies. And obviously, it's not, like I say, a flavour you'd think it's coming from the peat. But for me... red fruits is always raisins, apricots, apples, all those flavors are super common. But red fruits is quite weird. Hannah's just asked what are the hogsheads. So we talked about sherry casks and we talked about the Solera casks. Now, when you ship over ex-bourbon barrels, they will quite often arrive as broken up and palletized. So rather than shipping a whole empty cask, we're just shipping air. They'll break down the cask and they'll ship the ends. And then what they'll do is they'll get the staves all lying on top of each other on a pallet. They're about the right size for a pallet, actually, surprisingly enough. And that means you can get hundreds of casks, amount of staves onto one pallet. Now, when those reach Scotland, you can either make it back into the same size of cask that they have in America, which is called an ISB, I think, International Standard Barrel Size, which is a couple of 100 litres. Or what's more common in Scotland is actually to make a little bit of a fatter barrel. So rather than, and I'm going to guess, I make up some numbers, but imagine a normal American-sized cask. The original cask was 40 staves in its one cask. What they'll do in Scotland is stick 60 in. So it's the same height, but it's a wee bit fatter, and that's called a hogshead. Okay, so it's a sort of special size of cask, and actually you get a little bit more liquid into slightly less staves eventually if you add up all the staves across a pallet. So it's a slightly more kind of cost-effective way of aging some whiskey. So that is a hogshead.
And do you find that with those as well? I mean, I know this will happen with kind of winemaking. When you put something into cask, the smaller the cask is, the more surface area of the liquid touching the wood, and then the more influence it has on there. But then the other side of it, wood is obviously a very porous. It's a natural product, so it lets air in and it allows things to oxidize. So you get sort of, with smaller casks as well, you get maybe less oxidization. With bigger casks, you get more oxidization, but less impact from the wood. Do you find that happens in whiskey as well? Do you find that oxidization happens? Does it have quite an effect on the whiskies or not? Or is it more just the kind of casks itself?
Yeah, I know it definitely will have a bit of an impact, but I think because you're using the same type of wood, it's been used the same amount of times in the sort of same conditions, whether you make it back into an ISB or a hoggy is a minimal difference compared to all the other things that you could change. And it really is done more for cost purposes. You're getting, like I say, from this pallet, if you made them all into ISBs, you'd be able to put X amount of liquid into those barrels. Whereas if you make them all into hoggies, that same pallet of staves, you can end up with an extra 10% liquid going in. So it's mostly done for efficiency. Also, if you've got sherry casks, then the difference in size isn't as different between them, because an American barrel looks a bit wee compared to a big sherry butt. So I guess maybe for stacking purposes as well, it's a bit more effective. But there will be a difference in flavour, absolutely. And you're exactly right. So less wood interaction, slightly more oxygen interaction. Interesting. But hopefully that helps.
It's interesting as well. Someone commented about how people like different things, and they said they really didn't like the peaty either. And to be honest, my dad's one of those people that's like, I can't deal with can't deal with it. Can't have it any peated. And there are people that come in, and that's perfectly fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I've found that as I've kind of drunk more whiskey, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have not been able to deal with peaty whiskey at all. But as I've kind of getting more into it, I'm finding the more I go into it, the more I like that slightly sort of smoky element in there. So yeah, it's interesting.
I'm the opposite way around. I started peaty. I didn't really like whiskey that much. Like I said, I drank some American stuff. I think I just like big flavors, and I like being able to just say a flavor like this is smoky. And so I started off Ardbeg, and I was like, Ardbeg's my favorite. I like Ardbeg. I can do Ardbeg. And then, people would hand me a Speyside, and I'd be like, this is taste of nothing. There's nothing here. I don't like it. It's watery. But now I'm starting to appreciate the complexities, the elegance, and all that kind of stuff. So it's different. Everyone's palate's different. And I'm sure, I don't know, John, whether you like olives, but there might have been a day. There was definitely, I didn't like olives one day, and literally 2 days later, I suddenly liked olives. Yeah. And your palate changes about every 7 years, apparently. And there will be some quite big changes, like olives are one, peaty whiskey is another. I just got my other half into peaty whiskey. He did not like it at all. He loved Islay whiskey. Bunnahabhain's his favourite. But he doesn't like the peaty stuff. Now, we just lived in Islay for a few weeks, but also during lockdown, I started, because I obviously house full of whiskey, which is great. And I'm usually out and about doing things. But, suddenly when you're sitting in your house, like, there's a lot of whiskey here, and it's just ridiculous. And we shouldn't be using all the storage space for whiskey. Let's try and finish some whiskey off. Yeah. And we didn't want to sit and like guzzle neat whiskey every day. So particularly when it was summer, I created something called the Lockdown Highball, which was whatever whiskey I wanted using up, plus ginger ale, plus a little bit of a fruit liqueur, because I also used to be a cocktail bartender, so I've got tons of fruit liqueurs. So I started off with quite a lot of peaty whiskey, because that's mostly what I had in the house. But obviously, I knew he wasn't going to drink it neat. Peaty whiskey, so shot and a half peaty whiskey, half a shot of whatever fruit liqueur you've got. But we started off with like fig, and then we went through cherry, and we went through plum and cassis and all kinds of stuff, and then topped with ginger ale. And
I am going to do that for my boyfriend, because my boyfriend is like, oh, I don't really like things that are too alcohol. He doesn't like the taste of alcohol, which is, I was like, I don't think I've ever come across anyone that doesn't like the taste.
Are you sure you like him? I'm not sure. Are you sure you like him? That would be like.
However, when I first met him, he only drank lager. Then I got him onto gin, and now he's got really into rum. But he loves like a dark and stormy, or a rum and ginger beer, essentially.
Yeah.
And then he doesn't like wine. People always ask me, why are you with him? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm joking. Yeah, but
I mean, are you?
But a little while ago, I was doing some practice for my WSET. I had a Gewürztraminer, and he tried it, and he's like, it's not actually too bad. And I was like,
this is my favorite grape. My favorite grape. You're winning there.
Right. You saying that sort of thing of like, of being like your palate changes every 7 years. There's hope for him still. But the idea of what you're saying about the whiskey highball with the a bit of fruit liqueur and the ginger ale, that sounds fantastic.
It's a smasher. Really nice
way of doing it.
It's funny because after a couple of bottles, we then moved on to a non-peaty bottle, and he tasted his Lockdown Highball, and he was like, is this a different liqueur? And I'm like, no, it's the same liqueur. It's the last one. And then he was like, I don't like this one as much. And I was like, you're missing the smokiness, aren't you? And now we're sipping smoky whiskies, and he's into it, and it's great. Yeah. And Virginia's done the same with her husband and olives. So yeah, good work.
Virginia's my colleague who's sat watching at home, and she's saying she can't decide which one she likes. She likes them all. And she also has been like, when I've told her about my boyfriend, she's like, why?
Are you sure? Hopefully he's not watching at home, else he'll be like, oh my god.
But no, he'll get there eventually. But yeah, there's hope then.
You can do it.
I like the sound of that in terms of like alcohol. And I think people always as well, they kind of reserve whiskey for drinking it as, as that's sort of special. Like you should drink it only neat, and you shouldn't drink it mixed at all. But it does make a fantastic ingredient in cocktails, and and having it mixed as well. And you can make a really refreshing drink.
Exactly. Well, we'd have never have been getting through the whiskey in the quantities we were getting through it during lockdown if we weren't mixing it, because there's not a chance we're going to sit and have, 3 double shots each just by, doing it. Because I love tasting it, but I don't want to sit and chug,
Yeah.
you know.
Of course.
So yeah, when drinking was the only way to get through kind of, you know, a day, then we were like, lockdown highballs are the one. And I mean, my house is still quite full of whiskey, but we've made a dent and I'm so happy with it. So
we need to do that, because I've got the IKEA black square shelves that everyone seems to have, and there's about 3 of those full of just alcohol, of just a mixture of either wine, spirits, like little bottles, big bottles, half bottles. Look, yeah,
I feel your pain. I've got like 4 cabinets.
I'm sure people are sat there thinking, well, aren't you too lucky?
I know, yeah. But honestly, there's no room for anything else, guys. All right, so now we're going to get in our little plane again, and this is where the journey becomes slightly less efficient, because we could have done this earlier, but we couldn't have done because of the palette, the flavor. We're going to fly. If we were just doing it based on air miles, we'd have done it more efficiently, but we're not. So we're now going to go to India. Okay, so we're going to taste a whiskey called Amrit Fusion from Bangalore in India. And if you're not liking the peaty stuff, then I'm afraid, my darlings, this one is another peaty one. But again, it's not kick you in the face, make your eyes bleed peaty. It's still quite, it's quite gentle on the smoke compared to some Islas. It's a bit more peaty than the last 2, though. Sorry, the Miyagikyo in this one. But it's also stronger in alcohol, so do be careful, guys. This one, we've gone up in ABV to 50%. And we're back to something that's around 5.5 years old, but again with tropical aging, because the south of India, as you can see here, it gets even hotter here than it does in Taiwan in the summer. A couple of, you know, a little bit still coolest evening is 17 degrees, but humidity really low. I know. So it's 3,000 feet above sea level, though, so it's higher than any of the distilleries in Scotland. And like I say, humidity 40%, so we're actually getting a bit of a different thing. And one of my favorite things is just Bangalore itself, not the county or the state that it's in, or India itself, just Bangalore, 1.5 times the population of Scotland. Okay, so yeah, these guys are just outside Bangalore, and surprisingly, you don't build a distillery in the middle of a city. Well, some people do, but these guys didn't. It's this farming family, and they have a lovely aquifer, beautiful fresh water on site. So as with Scotland, base everything around water. So the interesting thing about India, and those of you might not realize that India made much whiskey, is actually 3 of the biggest selling whiskies in the world are made and drunk in India. Okay. If you look at the top 10 whiskies in the world, there's only a couple that come from Scotland. If you're looking for things that say whiskey on the label. Now, remember our whiskey from Japan earlier? This is the same kind of stuff. This one isn't. This is what I'm going to call real whiskey. But those massive brands. Now, for me as well, compared to, say, Japan or Taiwan that we talked about earlier, these guys making whiskey in India almost makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? Because, you know, we took over India. Part of the point of having a colony is to sell your stuff to them. Yeah. But don't let them make it too, because then you're going to ruin your exports. So we encourage people in India to like whiskey, but we did not encourage them, didn't allow them to make whiskey themselves. Okay. So kind of makes sense that 1948, this distillery was built. India became independent in 1947. So literally the year after independence, these guys started distilling. Now, because they're so far south, they actually couldn't make whiskey straight away because they don't grow barley down there. They grow sugarcane and they grow fruit. So they made brandy and they made rum initially. But in the 1980s, they finally made enough money from making their local, and they did call the local stuff whiskey as well. So out of the brandy and the fruit, okay? But they also made brandy and rum. Then in the 1980s, they started using barley. Now, barley is grown in India because obviously, it's a massive country. There's not just one climate there. Kind of like Taiwan's it's got a few microclimates, but it's mostly all just super hot and humid. But in the north of India, particularly the Punjab and Rajasthan region, so the north left side of India, the climate is absolutely perfect for growing barley. It's the foothills of the Himalayas. I'm sure you can imagine, even though it's a bit further south in Scotland, it's altitude much, much higher and therefore cooler. Okay, and this is areas known as the breadbasket of India, and they grow tons and absolutely tons of barley. They grow all the barley that's needed and the grain that's needed basically for the rest of India. Okay, but the interesting about what they grow is they grow the ancient version of barley. So what we grow in Europe is something called two-row barley, and we've unnaturally selected our barleys over the last few hundred years, let's say 1,000 years, to give us more yield. Okay, we know that the barley stalk grows, you get these little grains on it, and the bit that gives you the good stuff in the grain is the middle. Okay, so you want a really fat grain, ideally, and the husk on the outside just gets in the way. It's annoying. Okay, but it holds all together. So what we went from, and what they grow in India is called 6-row barley. They grow two-row barley. We grow 2-row barley. They grow 6-row barley. So for each stalk, you've got 2 rows of grains. So each grain has got tons of space to grow real fat.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't get as many grains, but you've got nice chunky grains in there. You crush them up. There's a little bit of husk, but loads and loads of the starch inside, which then converts to sugar, which converts to alcohol and gives you all your stuff. Okay. So them growing what's called 6-row barley. So stalk of grains, you've got 6 rows of grains on here. So more grains, 3 times as many, if you like. If you count them at the end. But each one is little slender little thing with hardly any innards and a much higher proportion of husk altogether in total. Now, the interesting thing when you're doing fermentation, though, is that husk gives you flavor. Okay, so this ancient version of the grain is all about giving you a lot more flavor, lower yield, though. Okay, so you need a lot more tons of barley to make the same amount of alcohol. Now, if anyone's had any whiskies, so like the Bruichladdich Bear barley, I think Aaron did one before. There's this ancient version of the grain is grown in Scotland, particularly in Orkney, and certain whiskies do buy it from these farmers that are growing this ancient version of barley to see what difference in flavour it gives, and it gives a huge amount of difference in flavour. So if you've ever had Bruichladdich Bear barley or any of the other B-E-R-E, it's called barley whiskies, that's the same stuff. But that's the standard stuff that's grown in India. Okay, so they don't need to give it a special name over there. It's just barley to them. All right. So this barley is then shipped from the Punjab and Rajasthan region, malted in Delhi, and then shipped down to Bangalore. Okay. Now, the original whiskey that Amrit made, this is the distillery, not quite as pretty as some of the other ones that we've seen today, but built in the 80s, I can tell. This is the sort of second build, obviously, but the original one, the 40s. And, you know, very much designed to keep the heat out and keep the cold air inside. But the original whiskey, the first Amrit they made was all unpeated barley because they're not malting it barley themselves. So, of course, I'm sure you can imagine asking a random malt house in Delhi to start burning some random plant matter underneath there. They'd be like, you want us to do what? And they're malting barley for beer makers, for lots of other things. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm talking too long. Yeah, so they couldn't get it peated. Yeah. So their first whiskey was all unpeated. Then they were like, we really want to make peated whiskey. We quite like the Scottish stuff. They're not the Japanese palate. They love the peaty stuff because they've been drinking it from Scotland for an awful long time. And so they tried to make it peated, and they were like, well, Scotland makes tons of peated barley, so we'll just buy it from there. So that's their second whiskey was Amrit. It's called Amrit peated, unsurprisingly. And it's made from European barley. But of course, they've lost the sort of texture then of the delicious Indian barley that I just told you about. And they're like, we want to make our whiskey as Indian as possible, but we want it to be peaty. And this is what they came up with. Okay. So basically what they do is they mix 80% unpeated Indian barley with 20% peated European barley from Scotland together and make whiskey from that. Okay. So it's not that peaty because only 20% of the barley was peaty, but the flavor of smoke's really, really well integrated and really carrying through. But the texture from the Indian barley is just incredible. It's super citrusy. It's super creamy. Remember that oaty stuff at the beginning? I think it reminds me a little bit of that. So a lot happening here.
It's almost quite chocolatey. It's definitely got that richness, that kind of like creamy mouth coating feel to it.
Yeah.
And I've just now understood why it is called Fusion and why it has East and West on the label.
The label's quite like your brother did it on PowerPoint or something.
Well, considering my boyfriend's a graphic designer, when I take these, like, because when I go home, I'll take all of these home before taking them back to work. He'll probably look at it and be like, what?
Yes. Like, I mean, okay, and fine. And I love this. And I love this label. And I love this whiskey. And this is actually one of my favorite whiskeys in the world because I just love tons of flavors I mentioned before. And I love peatiness. And I kind of love the label. Like, I want it to look Indian. I want it to look old school. I don't want to be too slick and too designed. The other thing that I really love about this is no one's going to buy it by accident, right? You know how some people would be like, well, I've never tried it, but it looks pretty. Yeah. It's from a country that I've heard is really making really good stuff, so I'm going to buy it on a whim. So if you ever meet anyone who has this in the cupboard, you're like, oh, you know. One thing, because you don't buy this just based on it being pretty.
I mean, one thing I will say as well, I do kind of like it because I feel like it's kind of very sort of retro, but the label itself. But one thing that I do think is interesting to point out is that you often see that I suppose one of the easiest ways of looking at it is the champagne houses. So you get the really big champagne houses, you know, things like Moet, things like Veuve Clicquot, etc. And they have all this fantastic branding. They have all these fantastic sort of, say fantastic, I don't necessarily think they are, but you know, but you look at Veuve Clicquot and they do these little wine fridges that they put the champagne in, and they do like personalized, you know, cases. There's one year they decided to make hand cream tubes as the packaging for the champagne, which I think was absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, and then you look at other houses. So we have Bilcar Salmon, for example, which is one of our favorites. They spend very little on the branding. They make a gift set where they've got the rosé in 2 glasses, and then they've got one with an ice bucket, and that's about it. They don't do anything else at all. You don't see Bilcar Salmon branded umbrellas in beer gardens, etc., or bars. You know, you don't see the plastic Moet cups that they insist on serving Moet ice out of. You know, they're very much sort of, the money is spent on that product, and you can see sometimes. So even though something might have you look at the label and you think that's a little bit dated, that's a little bit to do with being redone. It doesn't necessarily mean that the what's inside the bottle is bad at all. It sometimes can actually be a really good reflection of what's in the bottle, because while these companies have they've got the time, they've got the funds, and they've got the money, you know, the team to be able to do all of that branding and to have that sort of marketing aspect of it. You know, there are a lot of companies that don't have that. So for them to spend on that can sometimes, you know, going back to what we were saying on the mixers, it doesn't matter about the cost. You've got to do what's right for what the spirit is.
The money's going to come from somewhere as well. And actually, I'm not sure if anyone works in advertising, and sorry if you do, but I actually get put off if I see a brand that's doing loads of advertising. I know that money to pay for that advertising has to come from the bottle price. Yeah. And I want the bottle price that I pay for, all that money, I'd like that to all have gone to making the liquid, please.
Exactly.
Rather than if they've done tons of marketing, tons of advertising, if they're on telly and sponsoring rugby teams, all that kind of stuff, I am 100% put off by that, because I'm like, well, that's where my money's going. So that means that what I'm paying for now, like out of this total bottle, I would like to have paid this much for the liquid, and the liquid, you know, have this much been spent on the liquid. But if I think this much has been spent on the liquid, then I'm instantly going to respect it a lot less. Yeah. So it's backwards. Obviously, advertising, the whole point is to, you know, build awareness and build prestige around your brand. But for me, I'm always like, no. So yeah, and I think things need to look real as well. And I do like a sexy bottle, but I love this one. And like I say, for me, this is, you see this in someone's collection and you're like, you've not bought that by accident. You've not been given it by gift. You have tasted it at a whiskey show in a tasting and been like, yes, no one else knows about this. No one else is going to have this. And it's kind of almost like the sign of a good, you know, you go into a bar or you go into someone's record collection, sign of a person who's got a really good record collection, sign of a good bar, having a good back bar. You're like, yes. If someone has this in their whiskey collection, you're like, okay, you like big flavors. You're my kind of person. You don't, you know, you're not put off that it's from India or it looks a little bit, I don't know what decade we'd call this, you know. So it's, you know, liquid is more important than packaging, and packaging is lovely. It can be very nice, but I don't care. Personally, like,
you know, we in the shop, you know, as much as we would like to be able to say that everything we sell is based on what's in the bottle, there is times, and perhaps not so much during COVID because of the way we have the shop set up, and you know, we're kind of cherry picking things to sort of show to people, but a lot of it is down to sometimes that looks nice, I'll buy that because it looks nice.
I mean, I'm the same with wine though. I have my wine knowledge is I've heard of some grapes. I know I like some, and then I'm very much, oh, that's a cool label. So you do what you know about. But yeah, we've got I'm going to say Samara, or it could be Sam. and then their surname begins with A. But Sam loves this one. Earthy peat, yeah, really good tasting note on this one. And yeah, you're kind of right with the kind of incense flavors. Again, it's tropically aged. Remember getting those tropical fruit notes. This is aged in ex-bourbon or virgin American oak casks. So remember the tannins that we talked about from a new cask, plus all the vanillas and the fruitiness you're getting from tropically aging an American oak cask, combined with the peat, combined with the texture of the barley. There's so much going on in here. And hopefully everyone's enjoying it. This one actually awarded, a few years ago, Amrit's kind of little, main award with this one was third best single malt in the world. Really? Just a few years ago. And obviously just blew their minds, guys, we Distillery in India. These guys were the first guys to make a proper single malt in India. So like I say, lots of whiskey, mostly blended, but still not what we would call whiskey over here being made in India. And these guys in the 90s were like, no, we want to make a single malt. We want to export it. We want the world to taste our whiskey. We think it's nice. And so we're like, okay, well, what rules do we need to follow? Who do we need to, get legislation from? What do we need to do? They worked it all out and they launched it in 2004 in Glasgow. They did the launch event in Glasgow. So I'm like bringing it home a little bit. But they did a blind tasting. They're like, can anyone tell which one's Scotch and which one's Indian? And no one could. And they were like, oh, success then as far as we're concerned. Yeah. So
like
awesome.
On it. The one thing I think about this one is like, even though it's really punchy on the palate, the note is quite subtle on it. So the peat is very delicate, just there in the background. Everything's very delicate. The type of thing that you can kind of sort of sit and really kind of ponder over and grow and grow and grow and give you different kind of flavors at each time you go back to it.
It's a great bottle for having a bunch of mates around as well, because you just sit and chatting, still drinking it. It still gives you tons and tons of flavour, and it lasts for ages, so you can make a really good point and talk quite a big sentence and still be able to taste it afterwards. And obviously we have just come from a solidly peaty whiskey as well, and so for this one to still taste more peaty, taste more, have tons more happening in it is quite a big deal, because again, your palates would all have been a little bit peated up already from the last one, all those kind of mushroomy notes, all those sherry cask notes coming through, and then this one's still just be like, boom, I'm here, and I absolutely love it. I have also really luckily, because usually if I'm going off doing food pairings, I'll do it in our accounts. So our main accounts for Amrit Indian whiskey, unsurprisingly, is Indian restaurants, the top end kind of Michelin star ones in London. So I've done some amazing food pairings with this. And this, if you think of like a butter chicken, like tandoori chicken, but then quite a creamy curry. You don't want to add spice to alcohol. Usually it's a bad combo. But if you go for quite a creamy but buttery curry with this one, it's absolutely incredible. But also if you've got kind of char grills, kind of lamb and stuff as well, just beautiful.
Yeah.
So sorry for anyone who's not had dinner.
I can think the type of restaurants that you kind of talking about as well. I know there's one in St James Park called the Quillen, and they are like sort of, I think they're quite kind of southeastern Indian cuisine. And when you actually go, the spice element of it, or when you taste it, the spice element of the food is never the prominent flavor. It's there just to, there's a lot kind of going on with it. And I think, I can imagine that actually, you say about spice and alcohol don't always go. And there is a very kind of like, very, very much a thing where if you've got spicy food, you kind of should go for something much more fruity or something softer. But times when spice is very complex, and you can get some really complex pairings out of it. And
I'm talking about heat spice, so like spice flavor, cardamom, all the flavor spices, absolutely delicious with this. But heat spice is the one you want to watch out for. But Amrit, there's the standard single malt, the one that's unpeated and it's at lower ABV, it's just 46%. That one with a spicier curry, because it's so creamy. It's just the Indian barley, so super creamy. But my tasting note that it's in this one as well, because that barley's still here. But when you have a bowl of cereal and then you finish the cereal and you're left with the milk at the end that tastes of cereal, that's the flavor that you get from this Indian barley, this 6-row barley. So it's the texture thing as well. It's lovely. Butter chicken. It's the correct choice, everyone.
I will say that the peat on it is really interesting. The peat, because obviously I think with Islay whiskies, when you first smell it, if you go back to the Port Ascay, for anyone that has any, that is the first thing you get, that lovely kind of like that burnt wood sort of smell. And this one, the peat's really very soft in the background. There's other things, but even on the palate as well, it's that creaminess that hits first, I think. It's quite cleverly done. The peat's sort of there just to build. It's still prominent. It's still very much a flavor, but it definitely seems to just scale back slightly.
Well, I think it's because it's not 100% of the barley. It's only 20% of the barley. But the way that they've used it is, like I say, to make sure it integrates into every stage of the process. It's really cleverly done. And that's the thing I love about Amrit. If you don't know anything about the rest of their range, and they do have an extensive range, is basically what they spend time doing is trying something, realizing it doesn't work because of the climate or the humidity or something else, and then coming up with a really creative and clever way that follows the laws of single malt, but is a creative way to solve that problem. So, for example, aging in sherry casks or port casks, they're usually made of European oak, which, when you put it in a hot country, goes really bitter really fast. And so, Kavalan, a wealthy company, come up with this as different solutions. They asked the sherry companies to make their casks out of American oak. Tick, done, solve the problem. Amrit don't do that. They're buying more traditional sherry casks because they're a bit cheaper and they don't ask for them bespoke. So made in European oak, but that they know that they can't age it entirely in sherry cask because it will then turn bitter after about a year. So what they do is they age first next bourbon, then stick it into a sherry cask or a port cask for a year, and then stick it back into American oak for a final year. I call it the sherry or the port sandwich. You've got American oak, and then sherry or port in between as the filling. And that helps balance out that flavor and stop the cask being too bitter. So Amrit, I think, just constantly are doing things that are done in Scotland, then going, oh no, hold on, it won't work that way here. Being like, well, hold on, how can we fix this? How can we make it so amazing? Distillery is super fun, and their range is incredible, and always their quality. They tell you something that's about to come up, and they tell you a really fun story about how they made it, and then, what they kind of messed up, and then how they fixed that problem in a really creative way. And then you taste it, and you're like, that is tons better than I actually thought. It's just based on that fun story. So really great range to explore, guys. And like I say, even just trying, I love the unpeated, the classic standard. Tasting that barley is incredible, but for me, the only way to make that better is to make it peaty, which is this one. So
I like the sound of that, where they kind of go, oh yeah, we did this wrong, and then we changed it, we did this, and it worked for them. You fixed it, it's okay. Like transparency, because sometimes I think these distilleries are doing these like perfect drams time and time again, and obviously there's times they'll try something and they'll just go, we're just going to forget about that one.
Well, exactly. In another country that had never done this before, so they're having to learn how to do it. And so this, I just changed the picture here because that distillery that I showed you before was their, there's their original distillery, not the original from the 40s, but kind of the rebuilt one from the 80s. But then they expanded 2 years ago. We were supposed to go this time last year, actually. So to see all the new things. So they've, out the back of that building I showed you before, they've built a new building which houses these stills, which are just beautiful. And again, you can see the shape here. These are all made in India, actually, rather than shipped over from Scotland. But this grey thing in the middle, again, both Taiwan and India have to have this, is essentially a spirit cooler. So things come through your condenser, but because of the heat and just the rest of the room, the spirit doesn't condense fully like it would do in Scotland. So they have to have a secondary cooler on here, a secondary condenser, just to make sure they've caught all the vapor. So just an extra thing that you have to do if you're distilling in a hot country. But again, these guys are having 12 to 16% angel share a year. It's aging 3 to 4 times faster, just like Taiwan. The climate here is more, generally more hot. It's got a bit more of a wider variation. And like I said, the humidity is lower. So with Taiwan, I'm not sure if everyone knows about the ABV changing in Scotch whiskey when it's aging. So usually it's 2% a year that angel share you're losing, but most of that is alcohol. So the alcoholic strength, you put it into the cask at, let's say, 63, and it will decrease every year from then on. In Taiwan, that doesn't actually happen. It decreases the first couple of years and then stabilizes. But in India, because the humidity is so low, it's only 40%. It's actually the same as Kentucky. And the ABV goes up during aging. So Amrit will put things into the cask at, let's say, 63, but you'll get some cask strength Amrits coming out at 70, 72. So it's just another little interesting thing. So these guys are kind of, they're doing things in a Scotch way, but they're getting a bit of a Kentucky kind of vibe happening there as well. So it's super interesting. But I've definitely talked for too long. So I'm just going to show you some more pictures, and hopefully you've enjoyed the whiskies. And there's some tasting. I think I've said all of those things.
It's really interesting, though. I think there's a lot to kind of cover. It's one of those that each whiskey that we've done this evening, you can do a tasting on just that particular brand or just that particular sort of country. I mean, like we have done a Japanese tasting with the Nika range before in the past. And, that was, again, another hour and a half, 2 hours going through the Nika range, going through the history and the differences between them. So it's quite hard to sort of condense it all into just...
I know. I have like I have more like 4 hours of material on each of those brands today and countries, but hopefully I've given everyone a little overview and hopefully that's been useful. And obviously, whatever the flavors you tasted from each particular country, I've maybe given you some ideas that, quite a lot of the flavors are because of where it is, but that's not the only flavor you're going to get from any of those countries. So definitely worth exploring a little bit more. So if anyone's got any favorites, I'm not sure if you usually do this, then put them in the comments if you've got any favorites so far. Don't worry if you haven't, but just nice to see if there's any kind of votes for anything.
I don't know if I can decide on favorite. This happened the last tasting we did. I did a gin tasting with Masons, and they were like, Alex, who was hosting me, said, "Oh, what's your favorite, Hannah?" And I was like, "I can't decide."
Oh no. Well, I mean, if
he said to me, he was like, "If I was going to the bar now, what would you pick?" And I was like, "Okay, that's a good way of thinking about it." And I think out of kind of I think the Port Asceg is the one that's standing out for me for some reason.
Yeah.
But then
it's a really unusual one. Yeah. I mean, going back to the beginning, remembering the ones from the beginning as well. There's too many. Don't worry, you don't need to choose. It's fine. But just in case anyone has any strong feelings or questions that you've not asked, then do feel free to type them into the comments. But I don't know. Do you talk pricing?
I can talk pricing. Yes, I will just double check.
I don't know. It's just just in case it's something, because it's a thing that I always forget to do, and then.
So I do know that the this one, the Miyagikyo, is about $77.95 off the top of my head. Michter's is $54.95. So that's the sour mash. I'm just going to double check that is right. Yes, $54.95. Then the Drumshambo is new. So
yeah, sorry, throwing you in it here. Virginia's saying she's got 3 favorites: Drumshambo, Nika, and Asceg. So is that 1, 3, and 5? 1, 3. Just doing the odd numbers.
Yes, yeah. 1, 3, 5. And then Kevlar. This is the thing at the moment, because we've not got labels on anything. It's
sorry, my darling.
It's fine. It's a real.
Dropped you right in it.
$62.95. The Port Asceg 12-year-old.
Do you have any of that? Because it is so limited. Did you manage to get some?
Right, I can't tell you now. The autumn, yes, we do. We do have some in. That's $74.95. So that one is, quite a bit. And then the Amrut. I've not done these in the order we've tasted them. I just realised. The Amrut is $57.95 as well. So they're not kind of.
So the Nika and the Port Asceg, I think, in the 70s, and then most of the others were in the 50s.
Around the sort of £50, around the £50 mark, which is good. Okay. But it's a real test on my knowledge at the moment, because of how the shop's set up. We've not got all the labels on, but there's all the prices on, but we could do with putting them all back on, to be honest, because there's times when trying to remember everything about them.
No, God, you can't remember everything. You've done very well. I still have to remember what age everything is. But we've got Samara saying Amrit Fusion's always a favourite, but Cavalan and Drumshambo as well. So really different flavours as well. I mean, even with Virginia saying Drumshambo, Nika and Asceg, that's 3 super different whiskies. And almost like any of those 3, you could probably pick 3 that would be like enough for your whiskies for life. You've got a summery, light, breezy one, then you've got a slightly more intense one, and then you've got a smoky one. You could make a little range up for you'd be like, this is me now, I'm fine.
I suppose that the thing with whiskey as well is that you have different whiskies for different occasions or different sort of times. So they're really lovely. The big peated ones are lovely in the kind of winter months when it's cold, and you're saying that about the Scots wanted something warming, something to give them energy, and that's what the peated whiskies tend to do. And then in the summertime, when it's hotter and you want something lighter and you might want to drink it as a highball, something like the Drumshambo that's got that slightly more vibrant kind of character to it would be really nice in that sort of element as well. So I do think there's never really just one particular alcohol for one particular occasion, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, Drumshambo, you've got a mate who you're trying to get into whiskey, but they're not used to sipping spirits. So Drumshambo is an awesome one to get them in. Oh, there's mixes as well. So first 2 for Stephen.
But I think the mixers really threw me. That really surprised me. That kind of really challenged what I thought American whiskies are kind of known for. Because, I think like I said, it's that resinous piney note on it that really I was like, I did not expect that.
So that's your rye. You need to explore rye, Sam. I can run through mixes with you one day if you want. Yeah, it's quite a good overview into the category actually, because you've got a bourbon and you've got a rye in the sour mash, so it's quite good. Jill saying the port ascaic. Yeah. So people are staying.
It's a mixed bag then, isn't it? A bit of a mixed bag, which is good. So, but yeah, that's awesome. What's your favourite out of the range, Steph, or is that just not
like choosing my children? I mean, I think, like I said, the Amrit, I love finishing on. I love the sounds bad, I love those low expectations. But I also like when you said at the beginning you sort of said some nice things about me, and I'm like, no, don't do that. I like low expectations to then come in and when you at the beginning said it, I was like, oh no, this is awful.
I'm looking for personal experience stuff, so that's fine.
I know, but people used to say, what do you want me to say at the beginning? I'd be like, introduce me as mediocre, please, and then everything will be right.
For the next tasting.
So I mean, for me, PT girl, but Miyagiki always blows my mind as well, because I didn't used to like space sides and that elegance there. Drumshambo is new, and I'm really loving to getting to know that as well. The port cask is so juicy of Cavalan. Like I say, that makes a sour mash, that balance between those grains. And a Port Ascaic Isla, just essentially my spiritual home. So all of them. So people have enjoyed themselves. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We've got Tom saying Cavalan, Nika, Port Ascaic, but enjoyed them all. Good. And then Hannah's boyfriend Johnny enjoyed the Port Ascaic and Drumshambo. Lots and lots. Like I say, too much to tell you all about this evening, but thank you for your patience.
But we always enjoy the tastings with you guys. So it's been really interesting, especially going around sort of different sort of styles of whiskey, and hopefully opening up the idea of whiskey not just being Scotch or bourbon or etc. There's a whole there's a lot going on out there in whiskey. There's countries, Australia are making whiskey. We've got some whiskey from some Danish whiskey in. We've got England as well.
Scandies are smashing it right now. And like I say, those American craft distilleries making single malt, really interesting. There's a couple of great ones. Particularly, there's one called Westland, who I went and visited a couple of years ago from Seattle. It's great. Tons of places, almost every country now. I'm excited because if something's just arrived in the country, it's not one of ours. No, just not doing my job at all. But there's a Mexican corn whiskey that's come in, and I'm super excited to try that.
We don't have it in the shop I'm in here in Forward, but we have got that one in, and apparently it's bonkers. Yeah,
I really want to try that. So tons of worlds to explore, guys. If we can't get there, then whiskey will come to us, and it'll be all right.
Definitely, but Well, I think that's a good kind of note to kind of end it on as well. And I realise we have been talking for nearly 2.5 hours. So, but it's been really lovely talking to you all through it all, Steph. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. If anyone does have any questions afterwards that they think about, they just do let us know. We will always try and get the answer for them as well. And we've got all of these in stock, but we have got quite a range of stuff as well. I'm really glad everyone's enjoyed it. It seems to have quite a positive feedback, which is always good. So
thank you. It's been lovely.
So, we'll leave everyone to the rest of their evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and stay safe, everyone. See you later. Bye.